dāmas un kungi, dārgie kolēģi. Man ir liels prieks jūs visus šeit šoreiz redzēt. Un iesākot šo mūsu šī gada diskusiju, es gribētu varbūt nedaudz paskaidrot, kaut gan varbūt tas ir acīm redzam, bet paskaidrot, kāpēc ir izvēlēta šāda diskusijas tēma. Šis gads mums ir nesis milzīgas pārmaiņas, globālās satricinājumus, un kad tad vēl, ja ne šogad, runāt par korupciju un tās lomu iekšējā un ārējā drošībā, starptautiskajā drošībā, globālā drošībā. Sveicu jūs visus, mūs visus, Starptautiskajā pretkorupcijas dienā. Novēlu, lai šī mūsu diskusija šodien būtu auglīga. Paldies!
Straumes kungam, mums ir Saeimas priekšsēdētājs Edvards Smiltēns kopā ar mums, pēc kāda vārda ievadam viņam.
Godātais, tātad sveicināt klātsošie, godātais Straumes kungs, Your Excellency Ambassador of the United States of America, Mūrniece kundze, kolēģi. Sveicu jūs Starptautiskajā pretkorupcijas dienā. Karš Ukrainā mūs padarīs ir daudz redzīgāks un prasīgāks. Mēs skaidrāk saprotam, kur ir draugi, kur ir nedraugi un kur arī ir naidnieki. Mēs skaidrāk redzam, kur ir vājās vietas, un mēs arī redzam, kur ir nepieciešams ļoti būtisks pastiprinājums. Korupcijas un tās apkarošanas tēma ir absolūti vienmēr bijusi mediju un arī politikas dienas kārtībā. Un šis gads tajā ienesis ir arī jauna dimensija. Jaunu prizmu, caur ko mums būs jāvērtē arī korupcijas riski, starptautisku un drošības dimensiju. Ir skaidrs, ka korupcija vājina valstis un valsti. Tā nozog mums attīstības resursus, nozog, kas ir ļoti būtiski, uzticēšanos. Un uzticēšanās ir kritiski svarīga tādos brīžos, kad valstis ir apdraudētas. Taču tagad mums jāsaprot, ka tā arī nozog mūsu valsts drošību. Katrs negodīgs iepirkums, katrs nekvalitatīvi paveikts darbs, katras pievērtas acis apdraud mūsu drošību. Katra iespēja, ka arī starptautiskās sankcijas netiek pilnībā ieviestas, apdraud mūsu sabiedrotos un draugus, tas apdraud arī mūsu. Turklāt runa jau nav tikai par armiju vai citām tradicionālām drošības jomām ar tām saistītām lietām. Mūsu drošība ir arī enerģētika, sociālā infrastruktūra, viss, kas ir mūsu ikdienas dzīves pamatā. Viss, kas kritiskā brīdī var izrādīties arī vājais ķēdes posms. Mēs esam tik stipri, cik ir vājākais mūsu ķēdes posms. Tāpēc, ka kaut kas nozagts, kaut kas izsaimniekots, kaut kas ir neizdarīts, un tieši tas ir tas, ko mēs nedrīkstam pieļaut. Te nevar būt sīkumu vai arī mazsvarīgu lietu. Tāpēc mums uz korupciju jāskatās ar vēl redzīgākām acīm, ar lielāku prasību pret korupcijas apkarotājiem, bet vienlaikus ne tikai prasīt no korupcijas apkarotājiem, bet arī dot viņiem lielāku atbalstu. Tas ir mūsu kopīgs uzdevums. Tāpēc esmu gandarīts, ka topošās valdības deklarācijā korupcijas apkarošanai ir augsta prioritāte un ir visu partneru kopīga apņemšanās. Un šai apņēmībai tagad jāpārvēršas arī ir konkrētos darbos, mūsu kopīgā darbā. Esmu pārliecināts, ka tikai sadarbojoties politikas veidotājiem, korupcijas apkarotājiem, būtiski arī nevalstiskajām organizācijām un visai sabiedrībai mums izdosies Latviju padarīt drošāku, stiprāku un arī godīgāku, bez vājiem ķēdes posmiem. Novēlu jums šodien sekmīgu diskusiju. Diskusiju panelī būs ļoti zinoši, talantīgi un pieredzējuši eksperti. Un es novēlu jums idejām bagātu domapmaiņa, lai no šodienas mēs aiznestu jau katrs sev līdzi kaut kādu papildus pievienoto vērtību un kādas papildu idejas kopīgai rīcībai. Paldies!
Paldies Saeimas priekšsēdētājiem par labu vēlējumu un arī par cerīgu skatu nākotnē mums, domājot par to, kas notiks nākamajos gados. Šo pasākumu atbalsta arī ASV Tieslietu departaments un valsts departaments, tāpēc kopā ar mums ir arī ASV vēstnieks šeit Latvijā, Džons Leslijs Kārvails. Mr. Carlyle, we hope to hear from you.
Good morning, or actually good afternoon now. Mr. Speaker, Director Straume, Director Tauriņa, members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to come today. It's an honor to be here to mark International Anti-Corruption Day. The United States is pleased to continue our partnership with Delna and your tireless efforts to fight against corruption in your country. And I'm glad to see so many important colleagues, friends, and Latvians here today to mark this very important event. Because what is important on this is to take a commitment to action. And I think you'll see this commitment and action in real life today when, in the afternoon, when the U.S. expert who's here, Sarah Chase, will speak to you. Fighting corruption is a core U.S. national security priority, and we focus on it domestically in the United States. And we focus it as an important part of our foreign policy as well. And the reason why is corruption undermines democracy, respect for human rights, it impedes investment, it stifles economic growth, it hampers government services, and allows criminality to flourish. Moreover, corruption often provides a foothold for our most dangerous adversaries, who exploit the vulnerabilities in our systems and hurt our ability to deliver results for our citizens, thus destroying public trust. Our efforts to combat corruption are particularly important in partnership with our allies in NATO, our good friends such as Latvia. NATO, of course, is our most important alliance, whose resilience and strength is vital to the security of the people of the United States and Latvia. That is why our shared fight against corruption has been a top priority for the United States during my time here as ambassador. On this day 3 years ago, shortly after I arrived as ambassador, the United States sanctioned a prominent Latvian oligarch under the Global Magnitsky Act. And just 21 months before that, the United States Department of Treasury named a Latvian bank as an institution of primary money laundering concern. These actions were taken to protect U.S. national security interests. And I know that these actions, which are some of the most powerful tools that the United States has against corruption and money laundering, cause some controversy. But they work. They disrupt corrupt practices that are harmful to our shared national security interests. And here in Latvia, the government and civil society deserves tremendous credit for addressing broader corruption and money laundering threats. And I'd like to list a few examples. Latvia became the first member state under review by Moneyval. And for those who don't know what Moneyval is, it's the Council of Europe Committee on Experts on the examination of anti-money laundering measures and financing of terrorism. So it was the first member state under Moneyval to successfully implement all 40 recommendations by the International Financial Action Task Force. Latvia has made it mandatory for all joint stock companies to register their shares and submit information on their shareholders to the enterprise register. This increases transparency. And this was a commitment that Latvia undertook at the first summit of democracies led by President Biden last year. Latvia also has passed a lobbying law that has set comprehensive rules for engagement that cover lobbyists, and it also establishes a mandatory lobbyist register. Latvia has formed an economic crimes court to adjudicate complex financial crimes. And since 2020, Latvian courts have convicted more than 90 defendants in money laundering cases. They have confiscated over 100 million euros in money laundering proceeds. And in the last quarter alone, Latvian courts have convicted about 150 defendants on corruption and financial offenses. The United States, and particularly my embassy, is honored to support Latvia in these efforts. At Latvia's invitation, the United States Department of Justice and the Department of Treasury, largely through 2 recently created offices at the embassy here in Riga, has provided training and technical assistance to prosecutors, investigators, law enforcement officers, and judges. The United States collaborates closely with Latvia's Financial Intelligence Unit, regulatory authorities, civil society to help Latvia prevent and combat money laundering and corruption and prosecute financial, cyber, and organized crime. Our partnership, and it's important to stress that it's about partnership, is something that we do together with Latvia's civil society, with Latvian government officials at their invitation. But this partnership demonstrates that joint training programs develop the capabilities that our countries need to bring corrupt actors to justice and to build public awareness and confidence that are needed to prevent corruption. Over the past 24 months, our DOJ team, our Department of Justice team, has organized over 55 workshops for Latvian partners that have included about 190 prosecutors, almost 300 law enforcement officials, and 100 judges. And I have to commend our Latvian partners for their dedicated work on these issues and for the increased political and civil society attention to the corruption threat. Last year, President Levits participated in the Summit for Democracy that was, as I mentioned, hosted by President Biden. This is an ongoing initiative that brings together representatives from government, civil society, and the private sector to address emerging challenges to democracy, particularly corruption. And we're pleased, again, to host this in the coming year. President Biden will be hosting the second Summit of Democracies. I'm also pleased to note that this week, representatives from Latvia's Financial Intelligence Unit, the Prosecutor General's Office, the Corruption Prevention and Combating Bureau, and the newly formed Economic Crimes Court and the Baltic Center for Investigative Journalism are joining over 10,000 people from 180 countries at the International Anti-Corruption Conference in Washington, D.C., to continue building momentum for landmark anti-corruption initiatives. Thanks to these efforts, Latvia and the NATO alliance are more resilient to corruption, but however, we must remain vigilant. Russia's brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine is a warning call to all of us in NATO countries about the dangerous adversaries that we face. We must continue strengthening our institutions and our political will to defend our sovereignty and our freedoms. And we stand ready, the United States stands ready to continue our partnership with Latvia on these efforts. Thank you very much.
Paldies vēstniekungam. Es domāju, tas, ka Amerikas Savienotās valsts vienmēr ir bijušas tik striktas savā nostājā, ir bijuši tāds labs iedvesmas avots, taču arī visiem mums galu galā šeit Latvijā cīņā pret korupciju. Pirms mēs ķeramies pie diskusijas, ir vēl tikai daži ievadvārdi no Sabiedrības par atklātību Delna direktoras Inese Tauriņas, jo Delna ir viena no tiem, kas arī šo pasākumu kopā organizē.
Labdien! Saeimas priekšsēdētāja kungs, vēstnieku kungs, Saeimas deputāti, dāmas kungi, kolēģi. Sabiedrība par atklātību Delna šo pasākumu sāka organizēt šī gada janvārī. Un atceraties, tad mums jau sāka likties, ka Covid pandēmija lēnām, tā teikt, mēs redzam tuneļa galā gaismu šai Covid pandēmijai, un šķita, ka drīz mēs atgriezīsimies tādās normālās pirms Covid sliedēs. Taču tad mēs pamodāmies 24. februārī rītā, un mūsu pasaule atkal mainījās. Un jau kopš Krievijas uzsāktā kara pret Ukrainu, no šīs pirmās dienas mēs skaidri redzam, ļaujiet man teikt, kā uz Delnas mēs redzam apdraudējumu, ko korupcija, taiskaitā netīrā nauda, bet ne tikai ir radījusi valstu nacionālajai drošībai un arī drošībai pasaulē. Korumpētās elites, valstu valdības dažādas ir brīvi darbojušās, palielinot šo savu ietekmi rietumu demokrātijās. Jūs jautāsiet, kādā veidā? Saraksts ir garš, protams, bet ļaujiet šodien, sākoties ziemai, nosaukt tikai dažas. Nevienam mēs vairs neskaidrojam to, ka demokrātisko valstu enerģētiskā atkarība, piemēram, no Krievijas, ir mūsu drauds. Drošības drauds, ka viens iedzīvotājs šos savos maciņos un rēķinos to redz. Tāpat tās mēs esam redzējuši un varbūt nepietiekami reaģējuši uz dažādu politiķu karjeru pēc valsts amata atstāšanas, kas ved uz labi atalgotiem amatiem ar autoritārijām valstīm saistītos uzņēmumos un līdzīgi. Protams, mēs varam, kā Delna arī pieminēt, tieši netieši politisko partiju finansēšanu no ārzemēm, iejaukšanos vēlēšanās un līdzīgi. Aiz šī visa stāv korupcija. Un šobrīd demokrātiskās valstis cenšas stiprināt šīs vājās vietas, labot kļūdas, kuras mēs paši, iespējams, savu komforta dēļ, ērtību vadīt esam pieļāvuši. Saka, tā jau ir vieglāk. Taču ikvienai valstī, arī Latvijai, ir jāvelta visi iespējamie resursi, lai pilnvērtīgi cīnītos ar šiem korupcijas radītajiem izaicinājumiem. Katru dienu un neatlaidīgi, protams, arī Latvijai. Mums ir jāturpina ieviest starptautiskās rekomendācijas, mēs zinām šos darāmos darbus, mums ir jāstiprina mūsu iestādes, ne tikai tiesību sargājošās, bet arī ikviena cita. Mums ir aktīvi visām amatpersonām un ierēģiem jāatbalsta korupcijas novēršanas un apkarošanas pasākumu, nevis jādomā, kā to nedarīt, kā no kādas priekšlikuma atteikties. Un vēl daudz kas cits, par ko mēs runāsim pēc pāris minūtēm. Tāpat tās arī šie priekšlikumi un idejas vienmēr, protams, ir labi. Arī Delnai ir garš saraksts ar rekomendācijām, taču svarīgi ir vienmēr, ka ir kāds, kurš uzņemās atbildību un virza šīs iniciatīvas. Tieši tādēļ mēs arī gaidām skaidru ziņu no gaidāmās valdības, ne tikai deklarācijā, bet arī darbos, protams, no jaunās Saeimas, lai aktīvi iestātos par labu pārvaldību, godprātību, atklātību, cīņu pret korupciju. Un vēl ļaujiet pēdējo lietu pateikt, ka bez iedzīvotāju iesaistes, bez atbalsta pilsoniskajai sabiedrībai, bez šī efektīvā cīņa ar korupciju nebūs iespējama. Un mums ir jāveicina ikviena iedzīvotāja, gan tā, kas strādā privātajā, gan tā, kas strādā publiskajā sektorā, izpratne par to, ka korupcija nav atbalstāma, ka uzticētās varas izmantošana personiskam labumam nav pieļaujama. Sabiedrības interesēm ir jāstāv tam pāri. Un šis ietver divas lietas. Publiskā sektorā strādājošo stingra ētisko principu ievērošana, kad ik viens pat naktas vidū pamostoties zina, kāda rīcība nav pieļaujama, un otrs - trauksmes celšanas veicināšana, kad ik viens iedzīvotājs ir gatavs ziņot par savā darbā novērotiem iespējamiem pārkāpumiem, tai skaitā ieskaitot iespējamu korupciju. Šodien ir Starptautiskā pretkorupcijas diena, taču rīt ir Starptautiskā cilvēktiesību diena, un tās ir, ļaujiet man teikt, kā vienas monētas divas puses. Ja mēs vēlamies stiprināt cilvēktiesības, tad mums ir jāmazina korupcija. Paldies par uzmanību, un tad lai mums produktīvas šodien diskusijas un pēc tam darbi.
Paldies, Inesei. Jā, mums ir laiks ķerties klāt diskusijai, lai apzinātu, kur tad ir tie lielie riski, runājot par to, kur tad meklēt tos vispirms, kas mums visvairāk apdraud no iekšējās ārējās drošības, un pēc tam, kad esam apzinājuši tos, tad ko tālāk ar to visu darīt. Tāpēc aicināšu vispirms droši vien uz priekšā, vārds panelis skan, bet jā, droši. Vispirms Inese Tauriņa arī, protams, varēja nemaz nesēsties, var droši nākt priekšā Delnas vadītāja šeit, tāpatās kā mums ir arī Saeimas Nacionālās drošības komisijas vadītāja un topošā aizsardzības ministra Ināra Mūrniece ar mums kopā. Knap vadītājs Jēkabs Straume, arī droši iekšlietu ministrijas valsts sekretārs Dmitrijs Trofimovs un arī Rīgas Traņu universitātes profesors Saeimas Eiropas lietu komisijas vadītājs Andris Sprūts, tādā mazliet no ironiskā viedokļa skatoties, droši vien tos mikrofons ir jāieslēdz katram. Īsti jau es nesaprotu, kāpēc Andris sprūk Eiropā, taču vai ne ar korupciju viss ir kārtībā, tur taču nevajadzēja vai nebūt nekādām problēmām, vai ne? Tur jau nav korupcijas. Ir, nav? Ir?
Eiropā?
Jā.
Eiropā, principā, tiek uzskatīts, ka kādi 25%, precīzāk sakot, 5% no Eiropas ekonomikas ir, diemžēl, saistīti arī ar pēc dažādiem aprēķiniem, bet ja mēs runājam, ka 17 triljoni ir ekonomika, tad gandrīz vai 1 triljons dažkārt tiek izvērtēts, ka tā ir nauda, kas grozās korumpētās schēmās. Tā kā aprēķini dažādi, bet var runāt arī par lieliem skaitļiem. Tā kā Eiropā ir valstis noteikti, kur tā situācija ir labāka. Mēs skatāmies uz ziemeļiem kopumā, nu jāskatoties tie uz ziemeļos, mēs neesam tie labākie. Kopumā mēs neesam varbūt arī tie sliktākie, jo Eiropā, man šeit arī bijis arī knābi to ir atzīmējis, mēs esam 15. vietā no 27 valstīm. Tā kā, glāze pustukša vai glāze puspilna. Šķiet, ka, ja mēs tomēr tieši tā pretkorupcijas dienā šeit sēžam un aicinām, ka mums ir jācīnās, tad es teikšu, ka glāze noteikti ir pustukša.
Okay. Jebkurā gadījumā, lai arī kā nebūtu, ja jūs jūtat, ka jums tajā diskusijas laikā ir kaut kas svarīgs sakāms, protams, mēs esam šeit sarunātāji, bet kaut kā dodiet ziņu, celiet rokas, ja es varu staigāt arī pa zāli, tā kā ja jūs jūtat, ka vajag iesaistīties, pilnīgi noteikti. Arī par to varam runāt. Vienkārši, lai apzinātu to situāciju, un es jau, man liekas, pirms diskusija jau paspēju teikt, ka es došu pirmo vārdu Tauriņas kundzei, tāpēc, ka, ja mēs skatāmies, man vispār šķiet, pieminētais karš, vai ne, kas ļoti daudz kam ir uzlicis zīmogu, un tāpēc mēs arī daudz runājam par to iekšējo un ārējo drošību, un par karu runājot, mēs ļoti daudz esam, īpaši mediju telpā runājuši par to, cik liela ietekme šajā karā ir bijusi korupcijai, gan vienā, gan otrā valstī, diemžēl. Un man pat šķiet, ka iepriekš mēs par to tik ļoti neaizdomājāmies. Tāpēc no tāda skatu punkta, Inese, ievadiet to sarunu, kas jums šķiet ir tās riskantākās vietas, kur īpaši ir jāraizējas par sakām drošībai, ja tur ir tā korupcija. Kā pašai šķiet?
Es aptaujāju arī kolēģis. Es prasīju, lai nav tā, ka man tikai tāds subjektīvs viedoklis vai ne par to. Tas saraksts, protams, nav īss, bet ļaujiet man nosaukt tādas 3, kas mums izkristalizējās. Publiskie iepirkumi, mēs jau mazliet runājām par to naudu. Tur, kur ir nauda, tā teikt, sekojiet naudai, jūs atradīsiet korupciju. Tāds teiciens mums nereti tiek pieminēts, ko mēs pieminējam no kolēģiem, respektīvi publiskie iepirkumi. Un tie ir miljardi, tie ir nepilni 4 miljardi, kas ir publiskajos iepirkumos, un neaizmirsīsim par pašvaldībām, jo nereti mēs savā darbā redzam, ka pašvaldībās, kur ir arī ļoti 40% no publiskajiem iepirkumiem nauda, tur arī ir tā godprātība un tāda ētiska rīcība un pareiza tur nav un nereti tur ir korupcija. Tā ir viena lieta. Otra lieta, ja mēs šodien šīs dienas tēmas kontekstā runājam un domājam, tad mēs teiktu, ka arī tas, kam pieder Latvijas attīstībai būtiskie stratēģi. Privātais sektors, kur tā privātais sektors, jūs dzirdat mani tagad? Viss labi?
Jā, es nezinu. Zālē jādzird vai tikai ierakstā jādzird?
Ierakstos jau arī, tiešraidē arī būtu jādzird. Zālē jūs dzirdat, tas viss kārtībā. Respektīvi, turpinot šo stāstu, tātad, kam pieder būtiskie strateģiskie uzņēmumi, protams, kas nonāk pie lemšanas, respektīvi, ko mēs ievēlam, sākot ar to, ko mēs ievēlam parlamentā, un pēc tam, kas nonāk tādos būtiskos amatos, un tad lemj par dažādiem jautājumiem. Tās 3 populārākās lietas.
Okay. Domājot par šo vēl, varat kāds papildināt, kur jūs vēl redzat tos riskantākās lietas, ka mēs runājam par drošību?
Es varbūt mazliet reflektēšu, Latvija jau arī ir Eiropas Savienības valsts, mēs sevi vairs nenodalām, un Straumes kungam droši vien labāk redzams, vai tā glāze ir pustukša vai puspilna, mums te laikam katram sava perspektīva, viņam vienmēr būs šī glāze puspilna. Es gribēju vēl piebilst, uzticēšanās, par ko mēs sākām runāt, valsts vara, arī politiskā vara un sabiedrība. Tomēr tā korupcija ir tāda diezgan nepatīkama lieta, ka šo uzticēšanos deldē. Un uzticēšanos var veidot gadiem, gadu desmitiem. Šobrīd bruņotie spēki ir, tie, kam sabiedrība uzticas ļoti lielā mērā, un šī uzticēšanās, es teiktu, ir godam nopelnīta. Bet kaut kādas negatīvas lietas, kas pat varbūt pat tās ir novērstas, bet tā gaismā šo uzticēšanos deldē un grauj, minūšu, dienu laikā ļoti strauji, tā kā tās ir ļoti nopietnas lietas. Un arī mēs redzam, kas notika Ukrainā. Ukraina savu teritoriju zaudēja, iedzīvotājus zaudēja, pieredzēja ļoti brutālu uzbrukumu, tāpēc kā korupcijas dēļ arī šī bruņotie spēki, armija nebija pietiekami nostiprināta. Mēs redzam, ka Krievija zaudēja korupcijas dēļ, un te varam teikt, paldies Dievam, ka tā. Tā kā tie ir tie iekšējie procesi. Un principā tas sākas no tādām it kā mazām lietām. Visas lielās lietas izauga no it kā mazām un it kā sīkumiem. Un tas rezultējas, vai sabiedrība tic valsts varai, vai tā uzticas savām institūcijām, savām iestādēm, un pats galvenais, vai tā tic savai valstī un ir gatava to aizsargāt.
Es pie tās ticības tomēr nelieciet nost. Jo būtībā, kas to ticību tajā brīdī uztur? Tās ir divas lietas. Pirmām kārtām, vai man ir pietiekoši informācijas, ka es varu uzticēties, jo tiklīdz tas visu laiku galīgās slepenības plīvrī, kaut kādā brīdī var ticēt, bet varbūt es arī nezinu, var vai nevar ticēt. Otrs laikam, jebkurš skandāls jau arī grauj uzreiz, vai ne? Jebkur informācija.
Piekrīt. Lūk, jūs teicāt par to, cik daudz mēs zinām. Jā, tas vienmēr ir faktors, bet es domāju, ka ir jāmeklē līdzsvars. Ir valsts noslēpuma aizsardzība, ir ierobežotas pieejamības informācija, kas arī ir domāta tāpēc, lai kaut ko pasargātu, lai šo informāciju lieki neizplatītu, lai tie, kam tā nav jāzina, kas to varētu ļaunprātīgi izmantot. Un ne tikai šādās lielās valsts aizsardzības lietās, bet varbūt kaut kā sīki vai arī koruptīvi. Tā tad nevarētu ar to manipulēt. Tā ir viena lieta. Un otra lieta ir cita sfēra, kur nav valsts noslēpuma aizsardzības nosacījumi jāievēro. Piemēram, ja mēs runājam konkrēti, tad jau pieminētās lietas bruņotajos spēkos, kad tā žurnālisti tā maigi bija teikuši, kaut kas ir iznests no noliktavām, es teiktu nozagts, runāsim tiešu valodu šeit. Tad ir jādomā, kādas ir uzskaitas sistēmas, vai tās ir mūsdienīgas, vai tās ir mūsdienu prasībām atbilstošas, vai tās ir pilnīgas, vai katra konkrēta lieta ir aprakstīta atbilstoši, un ne tikai aprakstīta, bet arī kodēta. Tātad, jā, mēs iestājāmies NATO 2004. gadā. Mēs izdarījām ļoti daudz, bet iespējams savā domāšanā kaut kur mēs arī mazliet iepalikām. Un, ja kaut kas nav izdarīts, tas ir jāizdara. Es arī domāju par dienestu izmeklēšanām, kā ir izskanējis. Vai tā var būt, kad vienā mazā šūniņā notiek dienestu izmeklēšana, kur divi izmeklē pusotru. Ja ir dienestu izmeklēšana, tai ir jābūt plašākai, piesaistot arī no citām institūcijām.
Jau parādās vairāk diezgan būtisks faktā papriekš Andru.
Jā, es varbūt mazliet paturpinot arī kolēģi teikto, tīpaši Mūrnieces kundzes teikto par šo starptautisko dimensiju sabiedrības uzstēšanos, domāju, ka ļoti svarīgi elementi, un arī nākot uz šejieni, kaut kā manā uzmanības laukā nonāca, var teikt, pirms 6 gadiem Latvijas Nacionālajā bibliotēkā, ka korupcija ir vēzis sabiedrības organismā un ka cīņa vai korupcijas apkarošana ir viens no patriotisma izpausmes augstākajiem tādiem aktiem, augstākajiem izpausmēm, ja tā drīkst teikt. Un tie bija tajā laikā viceprezidenta Joe Bidena vārdi. Viņš bija Latvijas Nacionālā bibliotēkā, un šie vārdi ir ļoti trāpīgi par šo vēzi un par faktisku cīņa pret to kā pret patriotismu. Un ko es gribu papildus vēl šim piezīmēt, ir tas, ka, protams, arī šī diena apliecina to, cik ļoti svarīgi ir tas, ka šī savstarpējā sazoba ar mūsu starptautiskiem partneriem. Un daļai starptautiskie partneri mūs ir motivējuši uz daudzām lietām, gan uz institūciju izveidēm, gan uz lielā mērā aktīvām konkrētām darbībām. Un, protams, ka gribētos, ka arī mēs paši, un noteikti mēs paši ir daudz lietas daram, bet tā vien izstāsta, ka šī starptautiskā sadarbība, gan organizācijas, gan arī mūsu strateģiskie partneri, ka viņi mums ir vajadzīgi. Un skaidrs, ka te man varbūt tā mazā bāža ir, ka mēs varam dažkārt pazaudēt kādu no šiem strateģiskiem sabiedrotajiem tādā izpausmē, kā tas ir bijis līdz šim. Tā ir varbūt tāda uzmanība, kas jāņem vērā. Un otrs elements, protams, ka krīzes situācijās izgaismojās gan tas labais, gan tas izaicinošais. Un krīzes situācijās, protams, arī korupcija daļa faktiski no sabiedrības, no valsts noturības spējas. Un, ja tu tiec uztverts, ne tikai, ka tu pats uztver, bet arī tu tiec uztverts, ka tavā valstī, tavā sabiedrībā ir korupcija, tas faktiski ir tieši aicinājums vai netieši aicinājums uz to, ka šo sabiedrību var mēģināt manipulēt. Faktiski atturēšanas elements tiek izņemts ārā no tās miedarbības krīzes situācijā uz ārpus. Un, protams, krīzes situācijā ir arī ļoti svarīgi, ka mēs, protams, lietas pilnveidojam, bet varbūt tā bāža, un tajā atkal atgriežoties pie Mūrnieces kundzes teiktā, ir, ka mēs ieguldam daudz līdzekļus. Un, protams, ka it kā šķiet, ka krīzes situācija pieprasa to, lai mēs ātri un operatīvi rīkotos, bet tajā pašā laikā, protams, ka šeit pastāv šie riski, ka kaut kas var tikt paslēpts aiz ātrumu, operativitātes un arī noslēpumainības, ja tā var teikt, šīs te auras.
Labi, es par to uztveru un uzticamību lieku aiz auss un sarunas laikā turpināsim. Es savukārt, labi, mēs diezgan daudz te pieminējām, daudz faktors, vēl par iekšlietu sfēras aizdomājos. Robeža jau arī ir viena no tām lietām, kur jautājums par drošību ir ārkārtīgi svarīgs. Ne tikai iekšējo, bet arī ārējo, vai ne? Un tur jau viena daļa no tām lietām, kuras mēs pieminējām, arī ir.
Jā, Aldī, jūs esat tik precīzi, un šī ir tā lieta, ko es arī no savas puses gribētu likt klāt. Protams, tā ir stingra sasaiste šobrīd starp iekšējo un ārējo drošību, kur mēs redzam, ka šīs apdraudējums, kas ir radīts ne tikai Latvijai, Lietuvai un Polijai, visai Eiropas Savienības drošībai, nacionālajai drošībai, šīs ir tā skaitā arī korumpēti virzīts modelis. Ja mēs runājam par instrumentalizāciju, kur tiek izmantoti cilvēki, kur mērķis ir panākt ietekmi uz sociālo labklājības politisko sistēmu. Caur, protams, valsts un nevalsts aktieru tā saucamo izmantošanu. Un šī nav jaunā prakse, kas notiek šeit pie mūsu valsts robežām. Tā dara nedemokrātiskie režīmi, kuri atbalstot organizēto noziedzību un, protams, izmantojot koruptīvās metodas, panāk šo ietekmi. Bet, ja atļausiet arī par to uzticēšanos, ko Mūrnieces kundze minēja, pavisam svaiga pieredze vakardienas šīs te padomes lēmums par Horvātijas uzņemšanu Schengenā. Cik svarīgs lēmums, kas apliecina to, ka ja valsts izpilda savas saistības, tad tam seko arī šīs te lēmums par uzņemšanu. Un, diemžēl, lēmuma trūkums attiecībā uz Rumāņiem un Bulgāriem. Lai kā arī būtu, neminot, un vai tam ir konteksts ar šodienas diskusijas tēmu, es atstāšu to jautājumu atklātu, bet ir pilnīgi skaidrs, ka tā pozīcija, kas ietekmē to, ka nav vienošanās, lai arī 100% atbilstība šo valstu uzņemšanai Schengenā, ir saistīta ar ietekmi. Vai tā ir politiskā vai kāda cita veida ietekme, bet šis ir jautājums par uzticēšanos, kur 11 gadi, tāpat kā mēs, ir grūti iedomāties, ka brīdī, kad pateicoties visu to cilvēku darbam, kas panāca Latvijas iestāšanos NATO, Eiropas Savienībā, Schengenā, ka mēs nokļūtu šajā situācijā, kurā šobrīd ir šīs divas valstis. Tu esi izdarījis visu, bet diemžēl netiec pāri kādai konkrētai interesei. Šīs ir par uzticēšanos arī papildināt.
Eiropas komisija saka, ka viņi visi izdarījuši. Austrija saka, ka mēs neticam. Un tad neko tālāk vairs nevar izdarīt. Straumes kungs, noklausījāties te tās idejas, bet jums ir pieredze, es neprasot par konkrētām lietām, protams, bet zinot, ko jūs esat redzējuši savā darbā. Redzat vēl kādas tādas riskantās zonas, kuras izgaismojas, domājot par to, kur ir tie lielākie riski drošībai?
Pirmais, ko es gribētu teikt, glāze ir puspilna. Nav tā situācija tik slikta, bet nevajadzētu arī bērt pelnus uz galvas. Protams, mums jau ļoti, ļoti daudz darba ir priekšā, gan iestādēm, kas ar to nodarbojās, gan sabiedrībai, gan partneriem. Līdz ar to es redzu tieši korelāciju, un tas tiešā veidā sasaucās ar to, ko Baidenkungs ir teicis. Valsts ir tik stipra, cik tajā ir korupcija. Un mēs šeit redzam, ka, protams, ka Ukrainā ar korupciju nebija viss kārtībā. Tur situācija noteikti bija daudz sliktāka nekā Latvijā. Bet Krievijā bija vēl sliktāka. Un te mēs redzam šo rezultātu. Ja mēs skatāmies no tāda skatu punkta, tad mums tā ceļkarte, kas mums ir jādara, kādu mērķi mums ir jāsasniedz, lai mēs nodrošinātu mūsu valsts gan iekšējo, gan ārējo drošību, ir ļoti skaidra. Ļoti skaidra. Vārds vārdā, ko pateica Tauriņas kundze savā uzrunā. Stiprināt, sadarboties, nepieļaut acu pievēršanu katram sabiedrības loceklim saprast, cik korupcijas ietekme ir patiesībā nozīmīga. Protams, ir liela loma iestādēm un arī nevalstiskām organizācijām informējot, izglītojot sabiedrību par šo, bet tam ir jābūt kā tādai mantrai, kur katram ir jāsaprot. Tas nav tā, ka kāda amatpersona ir korumpēta, un tas nesaistītā veidā neatiecās uz mani, tas attiecās uz visiem. Piliens pa pilienam, bet tas attiecās uz visiem, uz visu sabiedrību.
Bet te tajās dažās pieminētās vēl atstāju to mikrofonu. Mēs te noskatām, iepirkums skaidrs, tas reiz nāk prātā, vai ne? Noslēpums un tā sargāšana, tur jau arī ir korupcija, tur tas cilvēciskais faktors vienmēr eksistē. Zakšana tika pieminēta kā iespējamais robeža. Ir vēl kaut ko, kas nāk prātā, kur varētu būt tādi riska faktori, kuriem jāskatās?
Ir skaidrs tas, kad korupcija tādās varbūt netik caurspīdīgās nozarēs, kā varbūt iekšlietas vai pat vairāk aizsardzība, var veicināt korupcijas risku palielināšanos. Tātad ir nepieciešami ļoti stingri iekšējās kontrolas mehānismi, bet tā pašā laikā mums arī jāsaprot, ir jābūt balansam. Jābūt balansam. Joprojām ir balansam.
Mana mikrofonā nav. Pabeidziet vēlreiz.
Jā. Tad ir jābūt balansam starp šo atklātību, cik mēs varam sabiedrību informēt, nevalstiskās organizācijas informēt, un tomēr arī nodrošināt, ka šī informācija par mūsu kapacitātām, spējām nenonāk mūsu potenciālo ienaidnieku rokās. Tad te ir tas balans jāatrod. Tad, kas ir nepieciešams? Ir nepieciešams stingri iekšējās kontrolas mehānismi tajās nozarēs, kur ir tomēr tas noslēpuma plīvurs jāpatur.
Reiz mēs esam pie tās informācijas, un tas ir svarīgs jautājums. Uzticēšanās jautājums, kā es sacīju, lielā mērā ir svarīgs no tā, cik es saprotu vai es zinu. Ja es nezinu, tad es arī palieku uz to jautājumu zīmi. Ar slepenību bieži vien uzticēšanos ilgstoši nevar. Un te ir tā lielā dilemma, kura man šķiet tajā drošības jomā visvairāk ar kur to saskarās. Aizsardzības joma, iekšlietu jomu, jūs to informāciju sargājat. Bet es kā žurnālists reiz saku, tajā vietā, kur jūs sargājat, vienmēr ir, es laiks aizdomīgāk skatos. Kaut kas jau tur parādās, pietiek piemēram, rakstīts, redz, tur kāds zog. Bet es nemaz nevaru pārbaudīt, jo jūs sakat, nē, tā ir slepena informācija. Un te es arī palieku pie tā. Kā tad, lai to vidusceļu atrod? Jūs esat un būsit, arī jūs bija pie teikšana. Kur tad ir tas vidusceļš, kādā veidā sabalansēt? Lai neaiziet daudz vienmēr otrs puses. Nu, sākam iekšē droši, ja jums pieredze ir. Robežas, pieņemsim, ir viena no lietām, kuras starp citu skandāls bija.
Un šis izaicinājums turpināsies, jo arī šonakt 37 mēģinājumi ir bijuši iekļūt nelikumīgā veidā Latvijā, tā kā arī komisija redz, vismaz politiski to piedāvājumu, kā to darīt uz ārējās robežas, bet skaidrs, ka diskusija priekšā un tieši tas, ko jūs sakiet, tāda atvērtībā un transparence, ir liels izaicinājums šajā jaunajos apstākļos, bet Mūrnieces kundze un Straumes kungs minēja, protams, ka šī valsts noslēpuma aizsardzība ir viens, krimināla procesa izmekošanas noslēpums, kas cits. Gatavojoties šai diskusijai, mēs iekšēji ar kolēģiem šo brainstormojām un sapratām, ka precīzi piekrītu, ka ir vieta šai transparencei tieši tajā, kas nav šīs valsts noslēpums un kas nav krimināla, jeb izmekošanas noslēpums, bet atvērtībā visos citos procesos, kur tiek vērtētas kļūdas, lai uz tā pamata mācīties.
Kāds piemērs?
Piemērs, protams, kaut vai konkrētas kādas disciplināra izmekošanas, kā tikai arī minēts. Jā, mēs bieži vien, tas ir tāds iekšējais iestādes vadītāja instruments, lai pārbaudītu, vai visi šie iekšējā kontrolas mehānismi ir nostrādājuši, vai procedūras atbilstošas un cilvēku zināšanas un prasmes. Bet rezultātā, protams, ir svarīgi arī parādīt, ka šī bija nopietni tam pievērsta uzmanība, un kāds ir no tā secinājums, kas būs savādāk. Jo bieži vien šīs ir tās lietas, kas paliek ārpus, un, protams, tālāk, kā mēs zinām, ar lielu varbūtību informācija, kas dažādi tiek veicināta, nonākot dažādos nesabiedriskajos mēdījos, nesaucot vārdos, rada priekšstatu, ka šis process nav bijis izvērtēts, ja, ka viņš nebija objektīvs, ka viņš nebija neitrāls, jo arī kvalitātes jautājums, viņš nav pats par sevi vienmēr. Ja, viņš ir vienmēr iet roku rokā ar tā saucamajiem biznesa procesiem, jebkurai iestādē. Un viņiem ir jābūt saprotamiem, uz rezultātu vērstiem, efektīviem un lietderīgiem.
Jā, droši, tad viss pēc kārtas, tāpēc jums ir mikrofons, pirmais tiek pie vārtus runā.
Ja drīkst, es gribētu papildināt to, ko Trofīmova kungs teica jau no valsts pārvaldes viedokļa. Es gribētu paskatīties uz to no iedzīvotāju puses. Tomēr man gribētos, lai uzticēšanās būtu tāds visaptvarošs princips, kas caurstrāvo visu sabiedrību. Es gribētu tā kā agrāk aiziet no mājas un pat ja durvis nav aizslēgtas, zināt, ka viss būs kārtībā. Vai atstāt velosipēdu pie sētas un zināt, ka tad, kad es atgriezīšos, tas tur paliks. Sīkumi var teikt. Bet tikko kā notikušas Saeimas vēlēšanas, tas jau arī ir uzticēšanās jautājums. Cilvēki vēlot par konkrētu partiju vai konkrētu politiķi, pasaka, es viņam uzticos, un mana uzticēšanās ir mandāts, ka jūs darīsiet Latvijas valsti stiprāku, un cilvēkiem te būs dzīve labāka. Tāpat runājot par bruņotajiem spēkiem, par aizsardzības sfēru, gan redzējām, kā pieauga cilvēku skaits zemesardzē, tā arī bija skaidra cilvēku pozīcija. Es ticu Latvijai, Latvija ir jāaizsargā, un tas nozīmē, tas ir arī uzticēšanās un ticības tāda praktiska izpausme. Tāpat mēs vēlamies, lai bruņotajos spēkos būtu valsts aizsardzības dienests. Pirmais iesaukums plānots brīvprātīgi. Mēs gribam saviem pilsoņiem, jaunajiem pilsoņiem teikt, jūs ticat Latvijai, nāciet, palīdziet, aizsargājiet Latviju. Tātad es to uzticēšanos redzētu, ka tādu principu, kas caurstrāvo visu mūsu dzīvi, no praktiskajām lietām līdz visaugstākajai valsts pārvaldes sfērai. Un tad, ja tie politiķi, kuriem cilvēki ticēs, teiks, jā, diemžēl šeit ir valsts noslēpuma lietas, šo informāciju nevar izpaust. bet mēs esam to pārbaudījuši un sapratuši, ka tur ir viss kārtībā. Es ļoti ceru, ka tad cilvēki arī šiem politiķiem, kuriem viņi jau ir uzticējušies, arī noticēs. Un tomēr, atgriežoties atpakaļ pie tām praktiskajām lietām, ja ticēs par to sfēru, par to vienu jomu, kura ir atklāta, kur nav šī informācija jāsargā, tad par to nākamo sfēru, kur informācija nav brīvi pieejama, es domāju, ka arī uzticēsies. Tad ir jābūt kārtībā visām sfērām, un ja arī tā informācija, tā sfēra, kur informācija ir atklāta, ja tur viss būs kārtībā, tad cilvēki ticēs, ka arī tajā nākamajā informācijas aizsargātajā sfērā arī viss būs labi. Varbūt mazliet ideālistisks skanējums.
Nē, labi. Es domāju, es papriekš ļaušu piedot Inesei turpināt, tāpēc, ka tas jautājums ir, vai tās informācijas mums ir pietiekoši, lai tajā vienā sfērā redzētu, ka viss ir kārtībā, un tad es sacītu, nu labi, tad es uzticos, ka arī tajā aizsargājamajā sfērā viss ir kārtībā.
Es par to aizsargājamo sfēru arī gribu teikt, ka nav jau tikai atklājam vai neatklājam, ir jau vēl dažādi risinājumi pa vidu, piemēram, uz piemēru bāzes. Sabiedrība par atklātību Delna. Mums ir vienošanās ar Rīgas domi, ka Delna uzrauga, kā notika iepirkums okupācijas pieminekļu uzvaras parkā gāšanai, kā notika iepirkums, kā notiek darbi. Un šeit ir tas gadījums par to, ka jā, tā ir ierobežotas pieejamības informācija, bet ir kaut kā, bet mēs, tā teikt, iepazīstamies ar dokumentiem, esam klāt sanāksmēs, runājam ar būvnieku, visu pārējo, mēs redzam, kā tas process notiek, un tad mums tā teikt, mēs esam uzņēmušies šo sabiedrības interešu aizstāvības darbu, un tad izvērtējam procesus un arī stāstam tālāk plašāk sabiedrībai, neejot detaļās, kā tad šis process ir noticis. Un šis ir tas piemērs, uz kā pamata es vēlos teikt, ka, manuprāt, tas ir viens tāds labs mehānisms, kā tad stiprinot pilsonisko sabiedrību, ne tikai Delna. Jā, nav daudz citu organizāciju, bet īpaši reģionos mums vajadzētu veidot un stiprināt šādas līdzīgas organizācijas, kuras tad var iesaistīties tajā sadarbībā ar to pašu pašvaldību viņu iepirkumos vai ar kādām drošības iestādēm vai vēl kaut kur. Un tad vienojoties par to, kur tad ir tās informācijas atklātības robežas, tomēr piekļūt šai informācijai, strādāt ar to un pēc tam iziet ar publisku paziņojumu, jau tādu spriedumu un vērtējumu par to, kāds tad tas process bija. Tā kā tas ir tas, manuprāt, kas mums ir ļoti neizmantots. Un tad ir tas jautājums par to, vai publiskais sektors uzticās sabiedrībai, cilvēkiem, iedzīvotājiem.
Tas nozīmē, ka tajā situācijā, ir vairākas iespējas, ja šķiet, ka ar to uzticēšanos ar politiķi varbūt klibo, kaut gan varbūt pat neklibo, bet arī politiķis nodrošinās sakot, redz, te ir vēl viena otrais atu pāru princips, kuriem mēs savukārt uzticamies arī, ka viņiem varam atklāt informāciju, un viņi arī apliecina, ka viss ir kārtībā. Tas ir tāds savstarpēji, protams, man jāuzticās arī Delnai, lai es varētu noticēt tam, ka Delna pati ir uzticama. Kas arī, protams, prasa tā kā uzkrāt vai nezinām uzticības kapitālu.
Jā, paldies. Protams, es šeit vairāk saprasmes visiem jau ir un stāvot ar mani priekšā un pārstāvu, protams, Eiropas lietu komisiju arī un skars, ka tur šī Eiropas jautājuma mums ir ļoti svarīgi tas plašākais konteksts, bet vienlaiks es pārstāvu arī progresīvos. Un, protams, ka priekš progresīvajiem ir ļoti svarīgi uzsvaru uz tiesiskumu ievērošanu, uz caurskatāmību, uz atklātību un noteikti tas akcents tajā kopējā stāstā, tad tomēr jā, ir noslēpums, bet lai nebūtu tā, ka tajā situācijā tie, kas lemj par iepirkumiem, lemj arī par noslēpumu. Jo beigās sanāk tā, ka mēs paši sev uzliekam noslēpumainības grifu, zīmogu un paši nolēmjam, kas tā ietvaros kāda strateģiska iepirkuma, ja tā var teikt noteikti. Šeit, zinām, riski tomēr...
Tā noslēpuma ir par daudz?
Manīs atbilde ir kopumā tomēr globālā tendence. Skaidrs, mēs esam kara apstākļos. Šeit man nav uzreiz balts un melns atbildes. Bet kopumā globālā tendence ir tā, ka mēs tomēr ejam uz lielāku atvērtību, ka mēs iesaistām sabiedrību vairāk, ka mēs esam gatavi informēt. Un ja mēs par kaut ko neinformējam, tad mēs informējam, kāpēc mēs nevaram par to informēt. Ja beigās tieši tā vislielākā šaubēnu neusticēšanās rodās tur, kur pirmkārt nav skaidrs, kāds ir naudas izlietojums, kāpēc tā nauda tiek izlietota, par to it kā arī mēs pat nedrīkstam nemaz runāt. Un jā, skaidrs, šobrīd ir daudz jautājumu. Enerģētiskā neatkarība, drošības jautājums. Bet vai mēs drīkstam runāt tajā gadījumā par iepirkumiem, kas attiecās uz saules, uz vēja parkiem? Manuprāt, mums ir jārunā par to. Rail Baltica ir strateģisks infrastruktūras objekts lielā mērā, kas arī nodrošina zināmā veidā militāru apgādi. Mēs drīkstam runāt par resursiem, kas tiek ieguldīti un kādā veidā viņi tiek izturēti. Manīs atbilde, principā, ka mums par to ir jārunā. Mēs runājam par valsts aizsardzības dienestu, kurā arī paredzēti lieli izdevumi un kopumā par aizsardzības spējām. Es domāju, ka jā, protams, mēs iespējams nerunājam par to daļu, kas attiecās konkrētām kaujas spēju tehnoloģiskajām raksturojošajām iezīmēm, bet, ja mēs runājam par aizsardzības pārvaldību finanšu kā tādu, es domāju, ka principā šeit ir tiesības zināt, ja mēs runājam par vairāk, šobrīd drīzumā runāsim par vairāk kā miljards eiro mūsu izdevumu, nodokļu maksātāja naudas. Un, respektīvi, šajā situācijā, kā es teicu, man šķiet, šeit ir jābūvē tie papildus instrumenti. Tas jau, kas tika minēts par dažādā veidā sabiedrisko organizāciju, sargsuņu uzraugu, teiksim tā, iesaistu, man šķiet ļoti svarīgi. Man šķiet ir tradīcija, kas būtu Latvijai jāveido, ka konkrētās jomas ministrs, ja negluži katru nedēļu, bet vismaz katru otro nedēļu, kopā ar iespējams iesaistītējām institūcijām, kas ir pie šī lielā iepirkuma strateģiskās nozīmes, teiksim, lēmumu bijis klātsoši, nāk un skaidro arī, protams, nestāstot tās lietas, ko nedrīkst stāstīt, bet miedarbojās ar sabiedrību, stāstot par to, kāpēc šādu lēmumu pieņemt un kādu resursu arī tajā visā arī iesaistīt. Jo beigās mēs runājam tomēr par mūsu resursiem, un korupcija jau ir tieši tā par šīm te lielajām naudām, kas noteikti tomēr vienmēr ir bijis vilinošs. Korupcija ir bijusi, ir un būs. Noteikti, diemžēl, tas ir jāatzīmē. Jautājums, kā mēs ar to tiekam galā. Un man šeit absolūti ir politiskā atbildība gan makro līmenī, gan es teiktu tā arī mikro līmenī, tajā mikrokultūras līmenī, kā mēs komunicējam ar sabiedrību. Mēs tikai vispārīgi runājam par sabiedrības uzticēšanos.
Man gribētos, ka jūs trīs varbūt varētu reaģēt gan uz to, ko sacīja Tauriņas kungs, gan uz to, ko Sprūtkungs sakot par to, tā iešana uz izvērtēt. Iespējams, ka mums varam dot vairāk nekā dodam, un tur, kur nevaram dot, tur iesaistām vēl kādu acu pāru principu, kuriem mēs arī varam vairot uzticēšanos.
Es tomēr gribētu teikt, ka noslepenot, jo nav nemaz tik vienkārši. Mums tomēr ir noteikti normatīvi akti, kas pasaka, kas var būt valsts noslēpums un kas nevar būt. Līdz ar to tā, ka kādā iestādē vienkārši tiktu pieņemts lēmums, šo iepirkumu mēs vienkārši padarīsim slepeni, lai sabiedrība neredz, tas nav tik vienkārši, jābūt pamatojumam tomēr. Līdz ar to es attiecībā uz to, cik klasificēti iepirkumi tiek veikti un cik pārējais, tad es tomēr nepiekrīstu, ka šeit ir iespēja vispār kādām variācijām. Ja, protams, tiek pārkāpts likums un tiek noklasificēts iepirkums nepamatot, tur noteikti tas ir pārkāpums, par to jāsauc pie atbildības. Bet tomēr runāt par to, ka tad ir jāmaina attiecīgais normatīvais regulējums, kas nosaka, kas ir valsts noslēpums, kas nav.
Labi, es gribēju reaģēt, bet...
Pavisam maza piezīmē. Paņemsim ļoti konkrēti aizsardzības industrijas likumprojektu. Mūrnieces kundzei noteikti būs iespēja ar to. Tur ir konkrēti punkti par strateģiskiem partneriem un kā iepirkumi tiek veidot attiecībās, kā viņi tiek definēti un kā iepirkumi tiek veikti ar šiem strateģiskiem partneriem. Es domāju, ka tur ir zināmā veidā manevra iespējas. Iepazīsimies, kā saka, noteikti tur vēl ir lietas pilnveidojums, efektivizējums, bet kopumā nevar teikt tā, ka tas pilnīgi balts un melns uz papīra. Es domāju, ka šeit ir likuma ietvaros, ir zināmas manevra iespējas, kur noteikti arī tā politiskā atbildība ir ļoti, ļoti nozīmīga.
Droši vien, ka tas ir jāvērtē, bet otrs būtisks princips ir iespējamā informācijas noplūde un kaitējums, kas teorētiski varētu tikt nodarīts valstī. Tam es domāju, ka Sprūtkungs arī piekritīs. Tā kā es teiktu, ka ir jāmeklē līdzsvars šajā ziņā. Jā, sabiedrības tiesības zināt ir svarīgas, bet būtiskas informācijas aizsardzība, ar šo informāciju arī var dažādi manipulēt. Un te arī var saskatīt koruptīvas un dažādas negodīguma iezīmes. Paturpinot arī to, ko mēs sākām runāt par šo uzticības jautājumu. Ne jau tikai, tad es iešu mazliet dziļāk, ne jau tikai politiskajā līmenī ir šis uzticības jautājums. Latvija ir tiesiska valsts. Latvijā dažādi lēmumi iziet cauri dažādiem sietiem. Šeit mums blakus sēž knāba vadītājs, Straumes kungs. Darbojas valsts kontrole, kas uzrauga dažādu iestāžu tēriņus. Ir prokuratūra, ir valsts policija, kas izmeklē lietas, un galu galā ir tiesa. Tā kā šis tiesiskuma princips un arī valsts institūcijas ir kopumā ir izveidota sistēma, lai šo tiesiskuma principu nodrošinātu. Uzticēšanās nekad nedrīkst būt akla. Uzticēšanās ir, es teiktu, tas zelts, pie kā mēs nonākam, skalojot smiltis caur ļoti smalku sietu. Un Tauriņas kundze runāja par pilsonisko sektoru, par nevalstiskajām institūcijām, bet ir arī valsts iestādes, valsts institūcijas, kas arī strādā un skalo to zeltu ar ļoti smalku sietu. Un arī šajās iestādēs ir speciālisti, kas strādā ar valsts noslēpuma jautājumiem.
Tas, ko man liekas, es saklausu, gan no Ineses, gan no Andra, un man liekas, arī jūsu teiktajā, bet tās pieejas varētu būt divas. Tātad es pats kļūšu diskusijas dalībnieku. Tās pieejas varētu būt divas. Tā viens saka tā, bet taču ir, nāciet pārbaudiet apmēram tā, ko varat. Bet tas, ko man liekas sabiedrība novērtē un kur veidojās tā uzticība, kad politiķi, valsts iestādes pašas nāk primāri un saka, mēs, un nāk katru dienu, protams, bet nāk bieži un saka, mēs ļoti daudz ko darām, redz kā tā situācija, mēs gribam šo, mēs gribam to, proti to proaktivitāti sajūtot no pašas politiķa un valsts iestādes, tā uzticamība jau arī tajā brīdī krietni vairojās, un tā sadarbība veidojās krietni lielāka. Es alojos, jums mikrofoni ir.
Rīkstu, varbūt es piemetīšu, paldies, jo absolūti, man šķiet tomēr, ka te tāds varbūt divas filozofisks vai strateģisks filozofisks pieejas ir. Vai mēs apmierināmies ar to, kas ir status quo, un būtībā paļaujamies uz to, kas ir izveidots, vai tomēr mēs saprotam, ka šeit ir izaicinājumi, kurā mēs esam gatavi tomēr skatīties tos jaunos arī risinājumus. Es skatos tos rādītājus. No vienas puses tiešām, ko es jau minēju, mēs esam pakāpušies augstāk labajā ziņā korupcijas uztveres indeksā, no 42. vietas uz 36. vietu, no 17. vietas Eiropā uz 15. vietu no 27 valstīm. Bet vienlaikus ir, man te ir dati, 31% aptaujātāji ir atbildējuši, ka pēdējo 2 gadu laikā ir veikuši neoficiāls maksājumus. Iepriekš bija 21%. Turklāt palielinājās ar to uzņēmēju īpatsvars, kur būtu gatavi dot kukuli uz 27% un 19%. Atkal tā glāze pustukša vai puspilna. No vienas puses ir noteikti, ka puspilna, jo skaidrs, ka daudz kas izdarīs pateicoties knābam un daudzām citām iesaistītām institūcijām, bet tajā pašā laikā mēs redzam arī tendences, kas faktiski ir pretēji uzticēšanās tendencei. Šī ir principā par to, ka mēs esam gatavi iesaistīties, ka mēs esam bijuši iesaistīti, diemžēl šeit ir nelabvēlīgas tendences. Tad jautājums, mēs paliekam status quo, un jā, viss ir kārtībā, vai tomēr mēs proaktīvi meklējam risinājumus, kā arī norādīja, ka tomēr mums ir jāmeklē jauni veidi, kā mēs sabiedrību uzrunājam, kā mēs to uzticēšanos būvējam. Sabiedrības uzticēšanās būvēšanas ir ikdienas referendums, ja tā var teikt. Tad arī domājam par tiem jauniem risinājumiem, kā mēs šodien, ko mēs piedāvājam. Tā kā te ir zināms radošums nepieciešams.
Jā, par tiem korupcijas uztveres indeksu mēs parasti vietas neskatāmies, jo tas nav tik precīzs rādītājs, bet Latvija ir 59 punkti un Eiropas Savienības vidējais ir 64, un ļaujiet teikt, Igaunijā ir 74 punkti, jo vairāk, jo mazāk korupcijas, jo vairāk punktu. Mums ir 59 un diezgan ilgstoši, un ja mums ir nacionālais attīstības plāns ar 67 punktiem pēc 5 gadiem, ļaujiet man teikt, nebūsim mēs tur. Tātad jautājums, kā mēs varam to mainīt un sasniegt, un tie rādītāji par to personīgu, tie iedzīvotāju aptaujas par to, vai gatavi dot kukuļus vai nē, vai ir devuši vai nē, tie mainās un no pētījuma veicēja puses, tā kā tas kaut kādu temperatūru vidējumu mums iedod, bet arī jāstrādā, protams, man liekas, ikdienā ar to. Bet atgriežoties pie iepriekšējā komentāra par to, tiešām tādu sarksuņu nevalstiskās organizācijas kā tādu sarksuņa lomu. Un tad mēs esam ar kolēģiem arī runājuši pirms pāris gadiem un par to, kā tad tiešām, ko tad mēs varam darīt kā organizācija, lai strādātu efektīvāk ar, protams, valsts iestādēm, jo loģiski ar ko gan citu, pie šīs korupcijas mazināšanas kopumā valstī. Un mēs tiešām vienā brīdī apsēdāmies un sapratām, ka tas atslēgas vārds ir sadarbība. Jā, mūsu loma ir būt sarksunim, tātad uzmanīt, pieskatīt, bet reizē arī mēs redzam tiešām pēdējos gados savā darbā, ka tā atslēga sadarboties ar iestādēm, ar to pašu prokuratūru, kur mums ir lieliski rezultāti, ar to pašu knabu, kur mums ir ļoti laba sadarbība, un daudziem citiem mēs redzam, ka tā mēs varam izdarīt daudz vairāk, un ieguvējs arī ir šīs te iestādes, kurās tad mēs ar savu ekspertīzi mazliet skatu no malas, mazliet tādu varbūt citreiz tādu stumšanu citā virzienā un enerģiju, mēs tomēr kopā tad varam izdarīt daudz vairāk nekā, ja mēs sēdētu malā un tikai rietu, tad, kad mēs redzētu, ka kaut kas nav pareizi.
Vai kādi grib no Dālas komentēt kaut ko? Ne? Šobrīd ne. Divas rokas redz. Jā, es paturīšu mikrofonu.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very informative discussion. The Baltic countries, and in particular Latvia, have done a superb, brilliant job of informing and warning Western Europe and other parts of the world about the Russian threat. Not taken seriously for a while, but finally they have. I know CNAB has done a very good job since its inception to reduce corruption. Now, various people, including Putin, have said that they will defend their interests vigorously. My question to you today, and I apologize if it has already been discussed, the translation in the beginning wasn't very good, so I may have missed that. The Russian influence in Latvia has been fairly robust over the years that I've been here since, say, 1991. Given the invasion of Ukraine by Russia now, how difficult is it to reduce the Russian influence substantially? I doubt if it can be eradicated completely, but I understand it's still vigorous with Russian influencers here fighting for Russian interests. I would appreciate your comments.
Man es drīkst to pārlikt, cik tā Krievijas iespējamā ietekme ir koruptīva problēma, ja var radīt problēmu, runājot arī par korupciju un iekšēju un ārējo drošību. Kā jūs to novērtējat?
Ja es drīkstu, varbūt tā pavisam īsi, ja sanāks. Es domāju, ka šeit noteikti ir pozitīva attīstība. Līdz ar to katram mākonim ir savu sudraba maliņu. Šajā gadījumā šeit ir šī sudraba maliņa, ka, protams, mums ir jāmobilizējās. Un mēs esam bijuši, negribētu teikt pilnībā, bet zināms noslēgtais aplis šeit ir bijis. Mums ir bijušas Krievu nauda klātesamība, enerģētikas jomā, es domāju, ka primāri, bet ne tikai. Tas savukārt ir padarījis mūs ievainojamāks arī ārējās drošības ziņā. Tas faktiski ir bijis ar vienlaiks, kā zināms, traucēklis mūsu pašu ekonomikas attīstībai, šajā gadījumā, piemēram, atjaunojuma energoresursu attīstībai. Lai to faktiski šeit noslēgtais aplis, kurā Krievu nauda definē to, ka mēs esam ievainojami, un papildus tas vēl nozīmē, ka mēs arī neattīstāmies. Vai vismaz traucē, zināmā veidā, mūsu attīstību un arī pašpietiekamību. Un es domāju, ka šobrīd mēs no tā apaļa, tas 24. februāris un tas, ko Krievija dara brutālu agresiju Ukrainā, mums likus ir, kā saka, šoks mums ir bijis visiem, es domāju, taiskaitā arī Latvijā tajā ziņā. Un te es domāju, tā ir tā pozitīvā tendence, ka mēs sākam meklēt arī izējas no tām naudām, kas nāk no ārpuses, un tomēr atkal jāatcerās, ka nauda no naudas atšķirās. Tas ir arī izvērtēts starptautisku institūciju vērtējumā, kad ir nauda, kas tomēr ir nauda, nāk konkrēti ar investīciju un ar biznesa bāzi, un ir nauda, kas nāk faktiski ar politiski mērķi korumpēts konkrēts interešu grupas, kas spēlē konkrētas politiskās intereses un vienlaiks padarot valsts ar ievainojamāk. Tā kā šeit es uzskatu, ka ir notikusi pozitīvā tendence tāds izrāviens Latvijā, un tas, protams, nozīmē ir attiecībā uz Eiropu. Bet jāsaka, Latvija bijis viena no tomēr ievainojamākām valstīm ar mūsu, ja tā var teikt, ir pagātnes mantojumu. Tā kā Latvija šeit ir devusi daudz tajā ziņā, ka informējas Eiropu par Krievijas agresīvo raksturu, bet negluži vienmēr ir veikusi savus mājas darbus. Šobrīd šie mājas darbi, ja tā var teikt, ir piespiest mums pašiem izdarīt.
Jā, es tikai varbūt pat reaģējot pats kā žurnālists mazliet uz šo repliku domāju. Redzi, ir jau tā, ka mēs arī domājam par to, cik iespējams arī kādi mediji vai žurnālisti mēģināti ir kādā brīdī ietekmēt no Krievijas. Un tad nav stāsts tikai vienmēr par kukuļošanu. Varbūt vienkārši nezinu, aiz kaut kāda īsā striķīša tiek turēts kāds no mums. Un tas ir jautājums arī par sabiedrību. Mēs jau redzam pat tajā sabiedriskajā, tajā publiskajā telpā. Reizēm šķiet, ka tur tie saucamā troļļu kustība, vai ne? Ka tur kāds apzināti pērk, lai uzturētu noteiktu viedokli, un tas arī ir tāds risku koruptīvais jautājums, pie kā droši vien iekšlietu ministrija strādā, bet es gribētu kaut ko teikt, Rafimokungs, ne?
Ja drīkst par to darīšanu paturpinot, ir skaidrs, ka arī šeit vēstnieks norādīja, ka Latvija ir tā pirmā valsts, kas izpildīja pirmā šīs manuāla prasības, un Latvijas tiesību aizsardzības iestādes, tā skaitā Knāps un visi pārējie apzinās to, ka primārais mērķis ir vērsties pret aktīviem, pret veicot šīs paralēlās finanšu izmeklēšanas, kas arī tiek darīts. Šogad, pateicoties arī vienai konkrētai lietai, ko vēstnieks minēja, jau 90 pāri miljoni ir ieskaitīti valsts budžetā, pēc tiesas lēmumiem, pateicoties visu darbam. Tiesību aizsardzības iestāžu Saeima, prokuratūra un tiesa. Un, protams, otrā dimensija šim visam atbildot uz jautājumu. Šis, protams, ir primāri politisks jautājums, bet no izpildvaras viedokļa šī rīcība uz robežas, ko mēs šobrīd daram, tiek likta par piemēru visai Eiropas Savienībai, kā ir jāstrādā izlūkošanai kopā ar civilajiem dienestiem, ar robežsardzi, lai novērstu to apdraudējumu, kas ir šajos apstākļos. Un pēdējais, protams, netiek pieminēts, bet es domāju, īstā balīte šobrīd ir saucamais paralēlais imports un eksports. Tas ir droši vien tas, kur mēs aiz naudas atmazgāšanas šobrīd tādas prioritātes saprotam, ka tas ir tās veids, kādā notiek problēma risināšana, lai turpinātu uzturēt gan pakalpojumu, gan preču pieejamību. Paldies.
Paldies. Tā ir būtiski faktori.
Jā. Ivo Leknāns Latvijas televīzija, bet es arī kā pilsonis. Diskusijas skatītājs gribēju pavaicāt visiem faktiski diskusijas dalībniekiem, ņemot vērā, ka šis mums ir valdības veidošanas periods, un mums cerams, visticamāk nākamnedēļ būs jauna valdība. Līdz ar to ministri nāks ar jaunām komandām, būs jaunas amatpersonas, un jau Trafimo kungam būs jauna priekšniecība, tur ministru birojas un tam līdzīgi. Un es gribēju vaicāt, cik liels riska faktors šajā tieši drošībai ir amatpersonu, kaut vai spēka ministrijās reputācijai, augsta līmeņa amatpersonu reputācijai, vai tās ir bijušas sodāmības vai krimināla procesi, vai, piemēram, persona ir apsūdzēta un ir parlamentārais sekretārs, kā tas ir bijis pat vairākās ministrijās šīs valdības laikā, bet, ja mēs no šī drošības aspekta pēc kā redzam, te Aidis pieminēja, ka ir kaut kāda cilvēka, varbūt tiek turēta saipītē kaut kādā veidā, vai šis nav risks arī personām būt kaut kādā interešu sfērā, mums nedraudzīgu valstu, ņemot vērā, ka to pagātnē, senā vai netik senā, ir kaut kādi šādi faktori. Kāds ir vienkārši diskusijas dalībnieku viedoklis par šo? Paldies.
Protams, lielā mērā ir saistīts tieši tiem, kas ir saistīti ar politiku skaidrs, bet šis ir tāds aktuālais jautājums. Tas ir jautājums par uzticēšanos, vai ne? Tas ir jautājums par to, reputācija ir viens no būtiskākajiem faktoriem.
Man atbilde ir ļoti vienkārša, ja runā par aizsardzības ministriju, tur droši vien ir specifiska ministrija, un tas ir arī pielaižu jautājums, un atbildīgās iestādes, cik es zinu, ļoti rūpīgi vērtē visu, kas ir saistīts ar šo ministriju. Dažādus faktorus, tā skaitā arī Leitāna kunga minētos reputācijas jautājumus. Tā kā šis siets attiecībā uz aizsardzības ministriju ir ļoti, ļoti smalks.
Tas atrisina visu šo problemātiku, kas iesmūgt.
Mūsu novērojums, piedaloties arī dažādās komisijās atlases procesos, ir, ka un arī vispār sekojot līdzi tam, kā mēs publiski runājam par šo reputācijas jautājumu, ir, ka mēs pārāk maigi pret to izturamies un pārāk nenopietni ņemam šos dažādus reputācijas riskus vai, teiksim, cilvēka pieredzi iepriekšējo. Saka, tā bija, jā, bet tas jau nav tik traki un tam līdzīgi. Man nav atbildes šodien, kā mainīt šo izpratni. Tas noteikti ir kopumā vispār šo diskusijas tēmu, kā vispār tādu veicināt cilvēku uzticēšanos un mainīt izpratni un tādu ētikas standartu iekšējo veicināšanu, bet, manuprāt, tātad apkopojot, mēs pārāk maz ņemam vērā reputāciju.
Ir te kādā vēl ko piebilst par šo?
Pavisam īsi. Domāju, ka, protams, ka cilvēku ieiešana amatos, tas absolūti ir ļoti svarīgs elements, jo beigās jau cilvēki nolēma par konkrētiem lēmumiem, par to, kas notiek konkrētajā jomā, tā kā cilvēks jau ir atslēgts, cilvēks ir centrā, jo tas ir galvenais lēmumu pieņēmējs, nevis kaut kāds abstrakts institūcijas, pati, protams, institūcija standarti ietver uzliek arī zinām veidā normas. Līdz ar to, protams, par nozīmēšanu gan konkrētos politiskos amatos, gan arī padomēs. Es domāju, tas ir jautājums, kam noteikti ir jāpievērš ļoti pastiprināta uzmanība. Ja mēs runājam kopumā, teiksim, par valsts kapitāla sabiedrību, arī pārvaldību kā tādu, kā tiek nozīmēti cilvēki. Un te arī es atgriežos pie tā, ka man šeit ir. Ja mēs paliekam tomēr pie tā, ka kapitāla sabiedrības ir saistīts ar konkrētu jomu, ar konkrētām ministrijām, tad iespējams šeit ministram ir jāuzņemās arī nevis zinām, bet pietiekoši liela atbildība par to, kas ir šajās kapitāla sabiedrībās notiek, un par to ir jāinformē. Ja mēs nepārējām uz citu pārvaldes modeli, par ko noteikti mēs arī varētu domāt. Bet es šeit piekritīšu arī tam, ja mēs runājam par konkrētām drošības jomām, aizsardzību, iekšlietu, ārlietas, arī tad skaidrs, ka šeit mēs varam arī paļauties uz atbildīgajām institūcijām, kas ļoti skrupulozi lemj par to, kā arī konkrētā pagātne ļauj vai neļauj uzturēt noslēpumu un beigās rīkoties valstiski. Tā kā, protams, ka šeit, es domāju, mums saskan daudzos jautājumos. Jā.
Straumes kungs.
Jā, reputācijas, tas ir viens. Otrs, gribu parunāt par ministriem, viņu padomniekiem. Manuprāt, šeit ļoti svarīga lieta būtu, lai padomnieks kādos jautājumos patiešām būtu arī speciālists šajā jomā. Nevis plaši profila saimnieciskās darbības veicējs. Ja, tā kā es...
mazliet tādi iekšēji, ja?
Jā, es gribētu teikt, ka ja mēs kā valsts tomēr nodrošinām, ka valsts kapitāla sabiedrībās padomēs, valdēs tomēr ir konkurss un izvērtē pieredzi, zināšanas, atbilstību konkrētām amatām, tad arī tomēr šis būtu tas līmenis, kur kad būtu mums jādomā. Es saprotu, ka tas ir politiskā izšķiršanās, un tas ir tikai ministru ziņā izvēlēt uz savus padomniekus vai nu štatu vai ārštatu. Bet, ja mēs šeit atgriežamies pie šī jautājuma par sabiedrības uzticēšanos, šis varētu būt viens no aspektiem.
Esam īsi pievienojoties, protams, ka tas pirmais siets mēs saprotam, ka ir atbildīgo iestāžu uzdevums, bet ne par to. Divas lietas, ko šogad aizgājušais ģenerālists Uzas teica vienmēr par to uzticēšanos, ka cilvēki ir labi un ļoti labi. Un lai būtu tā īsākais attālums starp to uzticēšanos un sekām, viņš teica vienmēr arī laiks rādīs par konkrētiem cilvēkiem runājot. Un es domāju, ka tā ir vienīga atbilde. Mēs paļaujamies uz to, ka iestādes izdara savu darbu, un tālāk, protams, šis ir šo cilvēku godaprāts un profesionālā rīcība kas tiek vērtēti atbilstoši viņu darbiem.
Nu, pabeidzot šo, īstenībā vispār apaļojoties tajā visā, es sacītu, es tajā, ko saklausu. Droši vien, ka vēlēšanas ir zināmas uzticības izpausme, bet acīm redzot nepietiekama, kā mēs redzam, vai ne? Tur tam sietam ir jābūt smalkākam ar to vēlēšanas, vien kā arguments sakot, nu, cilvēki viņu ievēlēja tātad, vai ne? Ar to ir par maz, acīm redzot, vai ne? Tā ir?
Ja nemaldos, prezidents Reigans ir teicis par ģenerālu sekretāru Gorbačovu, uzticēs, bet pārbauda, ja? Protams, ka valodā.
Es gribu teikt arī parlamentā, lai tikko kā jauns parlaments ir ievēlēts, tur ir virkne komisiju, kurās darboties var, vai pilnvērtīgi var darboties tikai tad, ja šis smalkais iets ir iziets. Tā kā tas jau visos līmeņos notiek. Bet, nu, arī ar cilvēkiem gadās, ka tu redzi vienas vērtības ievirzi vienā laika punktā, un pēc gadiem 10, 15 jau skaties, nu jā. Tā kā dzīve ir plūstoša, un uzticēšanās jau ir tas zelts, kas ir jāskalo dienā. Nevar jau būt tā. Pirms 10 gadiem izskalojām un ceram, ka viss ir kārtībā. Nē, tāpēc vēlēšanas ir katrus 4 gadus, un šīs institūcija veiktās pārbaudes daudz pieņem arī biežāk, tāpēc mums ir arī NVS aktors, un knābi jau strādā katru dienu, vai ne?
Mums jāpaļojās, laiks ir paskarējis. Jā, šī saruna mums iznāca vairāk uz uzticēšanos šoreiz, nekā es pat sākumā biju iedomājies, ka tā varētu veidoties. Bet man liekas, ka tā varbūt arī ļoti labi parāda visu to zelta stīgu, aiz kuras vajadzētu turēties. Tas, ko es kopsavelkot tajā visā, jā, es saprotu, tā palielināmais stikls vienmēr ir jātur uz tiem riska zonām, kuras mēs tur sākumā nosaucām, vai ne? Un tās patiešām ir un paliks vienmēr iepirkumi, robeža un viss pārējais. Bet šis uzticēšanās jautājums, droši vien es pārstāvu medijus. Man jau kā medijam vienmēr gribas arī līdzīgi kā to NVO dara, vai ne? Tā kā no tās atklātības viedokļus to skatīties. Un tā uzticēšanās jau arī veidojās starp dažādiem cilvēkiem, amatpersonām un starp medijiem ļoti dažādi. Un es domāju, kas tad to reizē vairo? To vairo tās amatpersonas vai iestādes gatavība pašai nākt. Tā kā tā proaktīvā rīcība. Tā gatavība kaut kādā veidā nevis sacīt, nāciet pārbaudiet, man nav nekas slēpties. Varbūt izslēpties, es nezinu, vai ne? Bet tajā brīdī, kad tu jau nāc pats uz priekšu un saka, redz, par šo vajag runāt, domāsim šajā virzienā, strādāsim šajā virzienā. Tas raisa medijos uzticību, tas raisa nevalstiskajās organizācijās, tīpaši, ja viņi jūt, ka te ir gatavība sadarboties, un tas līdz ar to raisa arī sabiedrībā. Viņi skatās, jā, un par tiem politiķiem sacīt balso. Vai ne pēc tam? Tā kā es jūs aicinātu mudināt, ties, kas pārstāvāt valsti un iestādes, šajā virzienā domāt no šī skatu punkta. Beigās ieguvēja visi sabiedrība kopumā, un tad jau arī tie riski mazinās. Tā man šķiet, pabeidzot šo sarunu. Paldies jums par interesanto diskusiju, visiem 5, kas jūs šeit bijāt. Delnas vadītāja Inese Tauriņa, Ināra Mūrniece, kas ir Saeimas Nacionālās drošības komisijas vadītāja, un jādomā, būs tiešām aizsardzības ministri, KNAP vadītājs Jēkabs Straume, iekšlietu ministrijas valsts sekretārs Tīmovs un arī Eiropas lietu komisijas vadītājs Saeimā profesors Andris Strūts. Paldies jums par nākšanu. Skatītājiem to saku, jums ir pauze līdz bez 15, un tiem, kas klāt arī, mums ir kafijas pauze, tātad līdz bez 15:02, un mēs pēc tam atgriežamies, tālāk jau mūs gaida īpaša lekcija, un, atsakot, turpinājums. Tā kā nepazūdiet. Paldies jums!
Sveicināti atkal pēc pauzes. Mēs turpinām pasākumu Korupcija, nacionālās un globālās drošības drauds. Un kā jau arī pirmajā daļā izskanēja, skaidrs, ka šīs tēmas nosaukums šogad ir tieši tāds, tādēļ, ka ģeopolitiskā situācija un Krievijas karš Ukrainā notiek. Un kā tad runāt par Ukrainu, neaicinot pašus ukraiņus. Un tieši tādēļ, pateicoties Korupcijas novēršanas un apkarošanas biroja ielūgumam, mums ir tā iespēja šodien uzklausīt gan no Kijevas attālināti Zoomā, bet tiešraidē Ukrainas Nacionālā pretkorupcijas biroja, jeb NABU pirmās izmeklētāja nodaļas vadītāju Olenu Korolovetku. Dear Olena, thank you for joining us. We see you on our screen. We hope that everything will work. So now you are online, live, and we are very happy that you could join our event on this International Anti-Corruption Day. And so we would be very happy to hear your short presentation as well on the situation in Ukraine. So the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us for this meeting. Esteemed participants of the event, I congratulate you on the International Anti-Corruption Day. My name is Olena Krolovetska, and since 2019, I am the head of the Division of Detectives of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Before that, since 2015, I worked as a detective and the head of the unit. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine is the new body in a law enforcement to combat corruption in an effective state. Established in April 2015, the NABU started its first investigations only in December, when the head of now, for more than 7 years of work, the NABU and SAPO have exposed 1,000 people, and over 700 cases were sent to the court. The number of cases is a dynamic figure that changes daily. There were about 700 such criminal proceedings as of beginning of December. However, the number does not reflect the complexity of investigations. There are such corruption schemes in the work of detectives that were never investigated in Ukraine before the NABU was started. If we talk about the priorities in the work of the NABU, they have not changed due to the aggression of the Russian Federation. After all, combating corruption in the military-industrial complex is one of the key areas in the work of detectives. The priority areas also include exposing corruption in state-owned enterprises and in the implementation of infrastructure projects, cleaning up the judiciary, and so on. For 7 years, the NABU and SAPO have exposed corruption schemes at more than 15 defense enterprises. Following the investigations, 14 cases on charge. Among them, there are a lot of high-rank officials from the state bodies of Ukraine. Cases against these people are during 2022, the NABU and SAPO notified of suspicion to 156 persons, and detectives are working on over 15 criminal proceedings on corruption in the defense sector. All of them have their own specifics. The detectives face certain challenges during the investigation. Firstly, it is a limited personal resources for investigating. Totally, there are 240 detectives and 40 prosecutors. After February 24, this resource became even smaller. A quarter of the SAPO prosecutors and about a fifth of the NABU detectives joined the armed forces of Ukraine. Secondly, it is a sensitivity of information that is the object of investigation. Crimes of this category are more latent, and information about its investigation is the field of state defense order as a state secret. Now, this situation is armed aggressions of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Next point is long-term forensic examinations. Sometimes we are talking about dozens of such examinations in one case. It is impossible to establish losses and incriminate officials with damage caused to the state without expert conclusions. However, due to the economic regime introduced with the beginning of paying for the services of private experts is not currently financing from the budget. Next point is long-term implementation of the request of international legal assistance. Most schemes involve shell companies registered in foreign jurisdictions. Such requests take from a year or more to be completed. And the last, but not least, is the obstruction in parallel investigations on the same facts and seizing primary documents by another pretrial investigation body. Appropriate expert examinations, which also could lead to destroying these documents by accident. To the above mentioned, we should add a competition for the election of the NABU director that is now in progress. And we hope that the new head, who will soon be elected on the open competition, will support the independence of the institution from external influence. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, you can ask me.
Thank you, dear Olena. Of course, we had a couple of problems with the internet, but I hope that, and I understand that we understood your presentation. Do you have any questions from the audience here for Olena? If not, then, yeah, okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Your last point there was obstruction by other agencies. Could you expand a little bit on that, specifically what other agencies, and give us an example to clarify? Thank you.
Yes, of course. First of all, we should start from the law enforcement system in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, we do have the National Police, we have the Secret Service of Ukraine, we have also the State Bureau of Investigation, and we have the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, and now we have Bureau of Economic, I don't know the last word for that. So the only difference for the cases. So NABU is the law enforcement agency which has to conduct investigations on the high-level officials, and we have almost all of cases which are not in the jurisdiction of another agencies. So the State Bureau of Investigation is also conducting pretrial investigation for officials, but they do have another jurisdiction than the Bureau. So what is going on in Ukraine in some cases? So, for example, we do have some case about the embezzlement on the state-owned enterprise, and NABU started the investigation. Then some persons, some law enforcement agencies like the National are the same procedure, but they try to make this and try to go for the documents and try to seize the documents, not to give them to the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. And we did have this in our practices. So when we started investigation, then we were trying to seize the documents from the state-owned enterprise. And then we found out that the National Police were seized that documents before us, just weeks before us. And then we were trying to find those documents at the National Police, and they told us that, oh, we sent the documents for the forensic examination, so you could find them there. We were asking, and the experts told us like, oh, we don't know what happened with those documents. Yes, we did have that documents, but then it was some water in our building, and we don't know what happened with these documents, but they were destroyed, and we don't know what we could do for you. So it could happen, and this is a real problem that we did have in our practice.
Thank you for this answer. And one more question, and one more question.
First of all, thank you so much, given where you are and what's going on, for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. This is a somewhat complicated question, so I hope I can make myself clear. You have shown ways in which the war has interfered with the efforts of your agency. For example, some of your personnel have been called off to take part in the fighting. Right. Also, I assume everyone's attention is now focused on the war effort and not so much on the anti-corruption effort. On the other hand, and this is a little bit political, but on the other hand, it seems to me that President Zelensky, who came to office under the wing of an individual who was, let's say, a little bit questionable, now has a lot of public mandate. So my question is, do you think the public support that he has gained through the war effort will make it possible for him to lead a serious anti-corruption, a campaign push once the war is over?
It's a really complicated question. It's a really political question. As a law enforcement, I could tell that we will do all possible and all that we can do, and we will flourish, and we will try to build our country, to rebuild our country, and to try to do our best in that. So about political will and about political give a comment on that. But as for the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, as I mentioned before, we hope that the competition for appointment of a new director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau will be finished soon, and our new director will support our independence of the institution. And that's the main point for fighting corruption in Ukraine, for fighting top-level corruption in Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us here from Kiev and Riga, and good luck with your job. And of course, what I can only mention, if you need any support, of course, you know that we here in Riga and Latvia are ready to help you as it is necessary. Paldies tātad par pirmo daļu, kas mums iedeva tādu tiltu no diskusijas par Latvijas nacionālo drošību un korupciju uz diskusiju par tādu globālo drošību. Un tieši šis, protams, Ukrainas piemērs tādēļ arī mums bija jāpārunā. Bet tagad tuliņās es došu vārdu, došu mikrofonu mūsu īpašajai viešņai no Amerikas Savienotajām valstīm, Sārai Čeizai, kura pēc Delnas ielūguma ir ieradusies Rīgā, lai tiešām iedot mums tādu plašāku skatu uz korupcijas jautājumu un korupcijas problemātiku. Un Sāra ir pazīstama ar savu tādu radošo novatorisko domāšanu par korupciju un tās sekām. Arī vakar Rīgas biznesa skolā studenti jau ar to iepazinās, un viņa ir pētījusi korupciju 5 kontinentos. Un tas mums, protams, ļauj viņai arī gatavojiet jautājumus, ļauj uzdot ļoti dažādus jautājumus. Un Sāra, gatavojoties arī šai vizītei, mums ir, tā teikt, es viņai prasīju, kas tad ir tie daži teikumi, ko teiktu par korupciju. Un ļaujiet man citēt un atkārtot, ko viņa ir teikusi, ka korupcija apdraud ne tikai demokrātiju un labu pārvaldību, bet arī visas sabiedrības nākotni, jo tā ir mūsu paaudzes vissarežģītākā problēma. Mēs šeit Latvijā arī daudzreiz runājam par korupciju un īsti nezinām, vai tā tiešām ir korupcija, un daudzas lietas saucam par tādām, kuras varbūt nemaz tādas nav. Tādēļ bez liekas kavēšanās dodu vārdu Sārai Čeizai, kuras uzdevums mums ir izstāstīt par to, kā tad korupcija apdraud globālo drošību. Please, Sarah, the floor is yours. So we are waiting for you to answer on our question, how corruption threatens global security. Global security, of course.
Well, but I may need it for questions, no? Yeah, we'll see. So again, thank you all for being here. This is weighty and quite a dense morning, afternoon to talk about corruption, which is not the most pleasant topic in the world. I actually think, so I do want to say that I got into this issue, not, because corruption's a really ethically terrible thing. I was in Afghanistan, and I knew that the Afghan government and its international backers were going to lose the war if they didn't address the issue of corruption, that they were in fact facilitating and enabling the almost flourishing of corruption in Afghanistan. So for me, I got into this as not a moral issue or an ethical issue or a democracy issue, but as a security issue. I'd also like to say, so I'm not anymore in the United States government, so I can be just a little bit more candid than my compatriot earlier on. Yes, the US has gotten a little bit better in terms of making corruption a foreign policy issue, although it took us long enough. There's a colleague of mine sitting in the second row, so he's gritting his teeth. But we're still not very good, we Americans, at looking in the mirror. For me, the disastrous failure of the war in Afghanistan didn't have so much to do with US foreign policy and that it was a foreign and security policy failure. In fact, Afghanistan holds a mirror up to us and what it might look like in America if we don't address corruption at home. And that's what I mean by existential threat. So we're going to get into all of this, but I want to start at the beginning. Whoops. Rats. I thought that I had my prop, but I'm going to have to go and do the even more embarrassing prop. I want to start at the beginning. That stuff. That stuff is the beginning. It's not that it itself is the root of evil, as the good book says, because this is paper. It's inert. It doesn't have agency. But at certain times in human history, money becomes not so much a system of exchange. It becomes a marker of social standing. It's the way you show you're winning. And that has a couple of consequences. Number one, this stuff, and I will pick it up this time because Inese had to actually come after me the other day, last night. This is light and portable, right? And we don't even use this very much anymore, do we? We use these, right? Means it is infinitely stockpilable. Add those two things together. Money is the marker of social standing, and you can infinitely store it. It's not fig trees or trees in a forest or sheep, right? You can only store so many sheep. That stuff you can store it to infinity. And that means there is no such thing as enough. Inese earns illicitly 36 million euros this year, so I have to figure out a way to have 37 because I can't let her be ahead of me in the race. And it goes on and on and on and on. So in periods, and I don't believe that throughout human history, money has played this role. I think it does in certain times, and then the public kind of reins it in, and then it comes again. But currently, in most of the world, we are living in a period like that. And in that type of period, corruption typically flourishes. So what do I mean by corruption? I don't mean everything that's bad, but I do mean more, and we have some law enforcement folks here today who are used to being obliged to regard corruption as a one-off, individual transaction, a single scandal where an event happens and money is either stolen or an unfair procurement process happens and there's a kickback, or there's some kind of money or goods or services that are provided in return for a government action. That is how our laws have been narrowed deliberately to understand corruption. And I think both in Latvia and the United States, there has been this very narrowing, mincing definition of corruption so that it becomes almost impossible, actually, to prosecute anyone for corruption. I mean, in the United States today, you have to be worthy of jail for stupidity to actually commit an action that is corrupt under the law. What I understand corruption to be is the operating system of sophisticated networks. And it's really important, I think, in an international context to understand this strange paradox that often you can have a weak state that is run by very effective and strong and successful networks. And why is that? Look at Afghanistan, for example. Why is that? It's because the networks don't actually intend to govern. They're not interested in being a state. They're interested in one thing. And government becomes at best a front operation. And at worst, government is the means by which they enrich their members. And, you know, I could give an example from the United States. I live near the city of Washington, D.C., the capital of the country. In the last 20, 30 years, there's been this explosion of gigantic houses that are so big you would never see a house except one built for, you know, nobility in the 18th century in Latvia. They're too near each other to be actually in the countryside, but too far away to make a community. And a single family lives in these houses. If you find out who these families are, they're mostly executives from defense contracting companies, right? In New York, you have similar houses that belong to members of the financial services industry. In Washington also, and in Boston, where I grew up in the Northeast, you have the same houses belonging to members of the pharmaceutical industry. And let's see, don't even talk about Texas and the fossil fuel industry, right? Now let's just take a look at public policies that have been influenced by members of these industries when they have been in government, because they cycle in and out of government, right? Well, let's see. 2 lost wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. A financial meltdown that brought down the economy of Latvia along with a bunch of countries, you know, around the world in 2008. A COVID epidemic that the United States did not cover itself with glory in how we reacted to it, and massive existential climate change. That's a lot of failures, right? I mean, that's significant failures. You could suggest that the United States is a failing state that is governed by successful, corrupt networks. I mean, there's an argument that could be made. So these networks feature vertical integration. Who in this room, and be honest, we were talking about the corruption perception indexes versus bribery surveys, right? How many people actually have given or would consider giving a bribe? Let's see hands. How many of you have ever had to give some money to a police officer or any public official? Am I going to get any honesty in this room? Once. Thank you. Honest man over there. Chances are, and it certainly would be the case in Afghanistan or Nigeria, that the individual police officer or doctor or school teacher or you name it, right? In Afghanistan, it was every single public official you ever encountered. Nigeria, I've heard the same thing. Uzbekistan, I've heard the same thing. That individual on the street doesn't keep the whole bribe. Some of it goes up the line. That's what I mean by vertical integration. And so it connects with public policy in certain ways. The police were underpaid in Afghanistan. Now, the United States was providing all the funding for paying the police and the military. Why didn't we say the police have to be paid a living wage? Not that that would stop them from taking bribes, but at least it would mean that they didn't have the excuse right there. And then they pay up the line, and what comes down in return is impunity. And that's how I came to understand how the system works, is because I was pursuing anti-corruption efforts in Afghanistan, and after the first anti-corruption arrest of a very unimportant border police official, President Karzai stepped into the issue himself. And I'm like, why would we were talking reputation a minute ago, why would President Karzai risk his reputation by releasing an obviously corrupt official who had been caught on judicial wiretaps and the whole thing? It's because it was more important to him to demonstrate to his network that he would uphold his side of the bargain, or else the whole thing would fall apart. So the important thing to understand in this context is there's no such thing as petty corruption, not in a systemically corrupt country, because the petty corruption is wired into the whole system. In the case of Afghanistan, it was worth between 2 and 5 billion euros a year in petty corruption. That's how much, when the bribery surveys, there were 2 separate ones. This was back in 2010. So that's a lot of money. But it's not only money, even though I say money is important, and I'll come back to that. But here I'd like to then talk about horizontal integration. And by that I mean these sophisticated networks include members who hold public office, members who are the executives or on the boards of major industries, and often out-and-out criminals. If there is a country with an epidemic of organized crime, you can bet it's a systemically corrupt country, and you can bet that the crime organizations are wired into the corrupt network. And this is important because it provides the network with this incredible variety of skills and capabilities, right? They've got people in government to change the rules. They've got people in business to reap the profits. They've got criminals to run, contraband across the borders, and also to commit plausibly deniable violence on behalf of the network. So, and then the next point, which I think is particularly salient in this part of the world, the networks are transnational. So let's go back and think about the Ukrainian situation. Again, you will correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that President Yanukovych was very much a member of the Russian kleptocratic network, except that he was also the president of Ukraine. So quite often the network will extend across borders, or for example, the most corrupt bank in the country of Honduras, where I did quite a bit of work, was also the biggest bank in all of Central America. So that's a way that the private sector can extend across borders. Or here we are in a port city, right? Is there any smuggling that happens out of this port by any chance? No, no. And it wouldn't be organized crime or criminal organizations that are technically located in a foreign country that would be responsible for some of that smuggling, would it, by any chance? Maybe. Maybe. The role of members of these networks who hold public office. Again, we often, even in the States, we had a government minister under the last president who I think took mattresses out of his office. You have that. I think the Clintons also actually took furniture out of the White House when they left the White House. I'm laughing, but that tends to be the type of corruption that makes it into the newspapers. When a public official puts something in her pocket and steals from the public, that's not the important kind of corruption. We know that. We spoke earlier about procurement. That's a big one. Let me go back to Afghanistan for a moment. Now, we lost, the Afghan government that we were supporting, the people of Afghanistan lost that war mostly because of corruption and the unwillingness to address the problem. But there were some military aspects of it, which had to do with why in a geographically difficult country like Afghanistan, facing a very mobile insurgency, do you decide to build an army that needs tanks and needs air support and needs highly complex technological weapon systems that the people of the country will not have the means to maintain on their own, right? Why would you do that? Maybe because of all the contractors, maybe because of our revolving door in the United States, where people who were close to the military, who had been in the military and then out of the military, got the procurement contracts, right? Therefore, you know, you procure the wrong types of weapon systems and therefore you lose the war. And we're in, you know, we've seen this both in Ukraine in 2014 and in Russia today. So procurement is a really big one. And I think we talked about a border fence, and I think we've had conversations about a Latvian rail link that's taking an awfully long time to build, you know, so not to be indelicate or anything like that. But the most important thing that members of corrupt networks who hold public office do is bend the rules so that they favor the networks at the expense of the public interest. And, you know, an example of that, I don't know what the process was to arrive at the legal definition of corruption in Latvia, but I know very well what it was in the United States. It was a series of Supreme Court decisions of our highest court. Now, what's fascinating is Americans are obsessed with the political balance on our Supreme Court. And we talk about split decisions, and now there's a super majority on the Supreme Court of conservatives over liberal, you know, right-wing people over left-wing people, to call it that way. What's fascinating is the series of Supreme Court cases that led to the narrowing of the legal definition of corruption, which started in 1987 and ended in 2016. The decisions are all unanimous. All the Supreme Court justices voted in favor of corruption, basically, in favor of the corrupt officials. In the final case, it was a governor of the state of Virginia who accepted, I don't know, 180,000 euros worth of stuff, you know, I mean, gifts, rides in an airplane, his daughter's wedding, I mean, convicted by a unanimous jury, conviction upheld unanimously on appeal, and then the Supreme Court overturned that conviction 8-0. 8-0. So that is how the networks, I mean, that's just one example of how the rules can get changed in effect to legalize corruption. So let me give you, then there's the issue, we talked about it before, a lobbying law has recently been passed here. Then the question is implementation. There's such a space between what gets passed and what is prioritized for implementation. So COVID, and I think every country that has had crisis offers a great opportunity sometimes for corruption. Lots of money getting spent, right? So the US Department of Justice recently indicted or started legal proceedings against a ring of fraudsters that said they were opening child feeding centers with COVID relief money, and no such centers existed. And these were people who were connected to criminal organizations in East Africa, right? And it's terrible, and they stole $100 million or something like that worth of money, and they were buying properties in Kenya and things like that, and that is bad. On the other hand, the US government gave $500 billion, euros, they're about the same now, to the Federal Reserve, our central bank. With that money, another $6 trillion was printed, except you don't have to print it anymore. You just add electronic zeros into the accounts, right? In order to purchase bonds, corporate debt. Now, these corporations had gone into debt not because of COVID, but because they were all buying back their own shares in order to enrich their shareholders. And now the US government, under cover of COVID, bails them out. And that's not all. The central bank, ours is divided up by regions. So the Federal Reserve of New York got the responsibility to purchase these corporate bonds. But the Federal Reserve of New York says we don't have the in-house capability. We don't know how to buy bonds. Interesting. What do you know how to do? You know, we don't know how to buy bonds. So we have to contract with a private company to do the bond buying for us. But the Federal Reserve of New York does not contract the private company. The Federal Reserve of New York sets up a new private company, an LLC, a limited liability company. And where do you suppose the Federal Reserve of New York sets up this company? In New York? Thank you. What is the biggest secrecy jurisdiction probably in the world? The state of Delaware, where incidentally my president hails from. Private company in a secrecy jurisdiction puts out a no-bid contract, which is won, glory be, by the huge money manager, BlackRock. Now go look at the personnel exchange between Treasury Department, Federal Reserve, and BlackRock. It's like a superhighway. It's not a revolving door. It's a revolving superhighway. So that is, I mean, that's more of a procurement issue than a bending the rules issue, but it also talks about it, or shines a light on differential enforcement of anti-corruption measures. So the Justice Department is all excited about this little $180 million, you know, scam that, oh, by the way, happens to be black people connected to Africa, you know, and God forbid we take a look at Wall Street. Let's see, enablers. These corrupt networks are supported by rings of enablers. We talked about money laundering in this country, so banks, right? Banks are classic enablers. Real estate, real estate agents, the art market is an enabling market. The people who set up secret corporations in secrecy jurisdictions, they're called registered agents. And then I would say outside of that is this even softer cushion of enablers. So as you see, I'm not particularly diplomatic, which is why poor Inese is now saying, God, why did I invite Farah to this thing, you know? So I often bite the hand that feeds me. So with that caveat, I used to work for an organization called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of these very respectable, you know, think tanks in Washington, right? So when I decided to write a book about corruption in the United States, Carnegie was a little bit less interested in being the, you know, it was okay so long as I was talking about corruption in Nigeria, or Ethiopia was the next place I was going. I'm like, I'm not going to do Ethiopia. The corruption story is here, right here in Washington. So shortly after I left, Carnegie adds to its board, and oh, by the way, it had decided it wants a giving board, meaning you put rich people on your board of directors so that they can make contributions to it was a nonprofit. So, and frankly, transparency, see, bite. I'm about to bite. So also, she was on the board of directors of either of Transparency International or the IACC, the International Anti-Corruption Conference, which my ambassador just mentioned. Her name is Ngozi Iweala. She's now the head of the World Trade Organization. She is the former finance minister of the country of Nigeria under a government during a period when $900 million worth of oil revenues were disappearing between point of extraction of the oil and the government treasury. It never even made it into the government coffers. And it was her colleague at the central bank who brought this to the attention of his country and who was immediately fired. She never said a word either then or ever afterwards regarding the behavior of that government, and yet somehow we talked about reputation a little bit earlier. She has managed to develop this reputation for herself as an anti-corruption person. I'm like, how? Anyway, Carnegie decided to put her on its board. What that is called is not money laundering, but reputation laundering. And believe me, reputation to corrupt officials is at least as important as money, second only to money, because it's through having the reputation that they can continue pocketing the money. Let's see. Okay. National and international security. This stuff is very important, but it's not the only issue at stake. So I'm in Kandahar, Afghanistan. One of the members of my cooperative gets a call from his brother. They're both former police officers. Their chief of police was blown up in a improvised explosive bombing, and they've left the police. One works for me. One is, he opened a little car parts store, and he's bringing car parts back from the Pakistani border, and he's gotten shaken down at least half a dozen times by police on his way back to Kandahar. He gets to the gates of the city and he says, I'm done. I've actually paid customs, which nobody does. I've paid 6 of your people along the way. I'm not paying another bribe. And he gets smacked in the face. You're talking Kandahar, Afghanistan, in the middle of a rising insurgency. This is a young man who's got his dignity, is about all he has. He is surrounded by people who would love him to join the Taliban. My cooperative member said, by God, he's a former police officer, by God, if tomorrow I see somebody planting an improvised explosive in the street and then I see a police car driving down that street, I'm not going to say anything. Now, he was a slightly dramatic young man. Maybe he would have, but maybe somebody else wouldn't, or somebody else would join the Taliban. Let's take this a little bit further. Sometimes it's not money, but it's favors that are extorted. So I'm in Nigeria, and a prosecutor is telling me about the person he knows whose husband, a woman, her husband was jailed under spurious charges. That's another thing that often happens, is jailing for ransom. And this was a bailable accusation anyway. And she said, look, my husband is diabetic. He will die if I am not able to provide him with his insulin and everything like that. And I will guarantee that he comes back for trial. The judge took advantage of her. It's called sextortion. And as a female, obviously, it makes me angry. Now imagine you're in northern Nigeria, you're the brother of this woman. What do you want to do? Kill the judge, right? Well, right around you is Boko Haram, and they would like nothing more than to arm you and have you kill the judge. So what I saw was how the indignation at corruption pushes people into the arms of violent religious insurgencies. That's how I came to understand that we would lose the war in Afghanistan if we didn't address the issue of corruption. Now, is anyone in here Lutheran? A couple of you? And yeah, exactly. Honest? Or do you have Lutheran people in your lineage? Go home today and Google the 95 Theses. About 87 of them are about corruption. It's all about corruption. What was happening, what led to the Reformation, was a German prelate who was already a bishop wanted a second bishopric, which was illegal, and he had to pay off the Pope to buy the bishopric, so he needed to sell indulgences in order to get the money to pay the Pope, right? And the indulgence said, if you put money in the box, the soul will fly out of purgatory. That's one of the theses. I've read them, believe me. And the Protestant Reformation was not like some nice little thing, right? I mean, it was bloody. They went after buildings, right? How many buildings, how many churches in Europe have the noses and the faces knocked off of statues, right? I mean, it's kind of like you go after the Capitol of the United States and pee on the, you know, on the paintings. So this is often seen in ideological terms. Oh, it was iconoclasm and people didn't believe in, you know, having images in churches. But let's go back to the money. These statues were paraded around the towns of Europe publicly during feast days, saints' days. And they were bedecked with all of this treasure that the church had amassed. So the people who were coming out to watch the procession are remembering the last little coppers that they put in the box to free their mother-in-law from, or maybe they wanted the mother-in-law to stay in purgatory, but free their mother from purgatory. And then they're seeing the gold and the jewels and all of that, and it was an insult. It was an insult. So the defenestration and the hanging, they often would actually hang statues. That had to do with the indignation at the extortion that was being perpetrated by the church. So that's one. Too often, however, it's the bad guys who exploit the indignation. So that will bring us shortly, I'll talk about windows of opportunity, but it's really interesting that you get this upwelling of anti-corruption indignation, and it's the corrupt who figure out a way to exploit it. And that was the corrupt or the violent or whatever. The Taliban are not better than, you know, the Karzai government or Boko Haram. And my friends in Nigeria who had supported Boko Haram, they're like, yeah, well, we did support them, but we were wrong. So we reformers have to figure out a way to get better in tune with the anti-corruption indignation that exists in all of our countries. Let's see. We've talked, I think, a little bit about corruption within the military and how it hollows out militaries and makes them incapable of functioning. And that was true in Nigeria, in Iraq, and in Ukraine in 2014, 2015. And we're now seeing it in particular in Russia. But as I say, in a way, the corruption in the US military is what contributed to the disasters in Afghanistan and Iraq. It also, and I just don't really think this needs belaboring, but I will just mention it because, and it's been mentioned already today, but it creates an opening that can be exploited by external powers that wish to have influence or control inside the borders of a nation. And again, Ukraine, I think, is a very clear example of that, but it's not the only example. And again, let me turn to my own country. We had a major steel plant that was going to be built in the state of Kentucky. Now, the state of Kentucky is the head of our lower house of Congress. Sorry, upper house of Congress. Mitch McConnell is from the state of Kentucky. And God knows what he was getting out of this, but the major investor in this steel plant was Deripaska's company. And Deripaska was under sanctions, so glory be, take a look at, it comes before the US Senate and sanctions are lifted from Deripaska's company only. So these kinds of things, or Schroeder. Why is Germany in such a disastrous situation right now? I mean, it was a very good investment to spend some money on Gerhard Schroeder, right? So now let's think about Hunter Biden and the Ukrainian energy company. I mean, it didn't work out quite the same way as Gerhard Schroeder, but that was arguably a great investment. What's the name of the company that Hunter Biden? Yeah, I've forgotten it now, but it was the biggest and run by the most corrupt oligarch practically, or second most corrupt oligarch in Ukraine. And my point is, okay, maybe President Biden, when he was vice president, didn't actually change US policy about corruption in Ukraine, and he didn't. But that doesn't matter. You're back to reputation. Once the son of the vice president is on the board of a corrupt energy company, I'm sorry to everyone, it looks like that is the US seal of approval on that company. It completely undermines an anti-corruption foreign policy. Let's see. Migration. How about that? We mentioned migration a little bit, and that's becoming an issue with Belarus playing around with it. But where are the migrants coming from? They're coming from corrupt countries that, because of the corruption, and war-torn countries, but often the two merge. In Syria, in Iraq, corruption and conflict are all interwoven with each other. And finally, I would like to end on this one, because this, to me, is the most significant international security issue there is, and it is the beautiful planet that we've inherited. This unbelievable miracle that we have been honored to be part of, and we are in the process of destroying it. And if you look at environmental destruction, and I'm not just talking about carbon, because that's a tiny piece of it, I'm talking about the rape of this miracle that we've been given. Almost all of it will take you back to corruption, because even though this stuff is now invisible, it always comes back to the land, be it real estate, be it infrastructure, be it logging, be it lithium, you name it, including, incidentally, climate finance. So we're just off of the COP, where it was all about, oh, loss and damage going to developing countries. Well, guess what? The kleptocratic networks in those countries see this as a great new revenue stream to capture. In Honduras, solar energy is owned by the kleptocratic networks. So what I'm saying is, the guilty feeling developed countries, as they start trying to participate in redressing some of the damage to our climate, don't trust, verify. Don't trust, verify. Okay, now what do we do? Now what do we do? From a public policy perspective, the first thing we have to do, I think, is map these networks. I don't know how often I have been in conversations with, either defense or foreign ministry officials in various countries, and said, do you know who's who in the zoo? We are too used to thinking about institutions, Congress or the parliament, the executive branch, the judiciary, business, blah, blah, blah. But the network weaves through all of them. And so you need to map the network. And I did this, my most recent book is about the United States, and I did it, at the time, it was during the Trump administration, but this is shared across the political line. I started with the first cabinet minister by the alphabetical order, Acosta. who was Secretary of Labor, I think, at the time. I mean, within an hour, I had 2 Supreme Court justices. I had the finance minister. I had the son of the Supreme Court justice who resigned, had in fact worked for the finance minister in Goldman Sachs, and then went to work at Deutsche Bank. And guess who he gave loans to? President Trump. And then you get to a sex trafficking ring. Believe it or not, this same guy Acosta, have you heard the story of Jeffrey Epstein? The same guy Acosta was the U.S. attorney in the state of Florida who gave a pass to Jeffrey Epstein. And oh, by the way, why was it? Not because Epstein had these highfalutin lawyers, because those highfalutin lawyers had been partners with the U.S. attorney when they were in a law firm altogether. So they were all friends. On either side of the table, they were friends. That's how networks operate. And oh, by the way, among Epstein's relations, you had both President Trump and President Clinton. So I'm like, wow, sex trafficking. I mean, at first I thought, I can't write this. People are going to think I'm out of my mind. And then the story broke. So map the network so that, and that means for law enforcement people, you're in a situation where you don't have sufficient resources, as the Ukrainian colleague mentioned, but it's true everywhere. That means you need to target carefully your investigations at members of the network who play pivotal roles, so that if you can only go after one person, that person counts. Instead, what typically happens is where there's a lot of evidence, oh, let's get that so that we can get a conviction, and you get the numbers. But raw numbers don't count. You have to be strategic. You have to be strategic in how you target your enforcement efforts. Okay. So I vote in a country where we've got 2 political parties that are basically both captured by the networks, essentially, as I described in the Supreme Court. Here, you vote in a country where you've got 30,000 political parties. I mean, I have a master's degree, and I started going through the political parties in this country. I'm like, wait a second, the Liberal Conservative Party? What are you talking about? And I'm like, what? And then you've got all these itty-bitty little parties that join forces with somebody else. You don't know who the hell you're voting for. Give me a break. You don't know who you're voting for. You don't know what they stand for. So how about if you among Latvians get together and come up with 2 or 3 principles of integrity? Agree amongst you citizens, 2 or 3 principles of integrity, and then when candidates are running for office, make them sign. Make them sign a pledge for these, doesn't matter what party they are, and then agree amongst yourselves that anyone, no matter what list you're voting for, any member of that list who you know to have violated the integrity pledge, you put a minus next to their name. Put a minus. All of you, join together. The kleptocratic networks have 2 things, power and money. We have what? Numbers. Let's use them. Let's use them. Let's not let these networks divide. They are trying to divide us up against each other because they know that we have numbers. And if we can bring the numbers together against them, we can defeat them. So they're dividing us up along political party lines, along urban and rural lines, along black and white, along blue and red, along gender, you name it, right? The corrupt networks don't take challenges lying down. They fight back, and their most effective tool is identity divide. So, last couple of things, well, one more policy thing, windows of opportunity. Keep your eyes out for windows of opportunity. So for example, the fall of the Taliban was a window of opportunity. If the US had really focused, US and its international allies, on a government of integrity, there was at least 2 or 3 years there where that could have happened. But windows of opportunity close very quickly. Also, when you have anti-corruption uprisings like the 2014 revolution, the Maidan Revolution, that opened a window of opportunity which Ukrainians used by setting up things like the anti-corruption office and whatnot, then you have the corrupt network striking back, in that case, in a very dramatic way. But what you often have is these corrupt networks will reconfigure themselves. So in Guatemala, for example, there was an anti-corruption uprising, toppled the government. A new anti-corruption person comes in, he's a comedian, sort of like Zelensky, you know. It's interesting because these networks love to put comedians up there, you know, and people know them and they're so pissed off anyway. Well, let's just say you to the old system by voting for a clown. In the case of Ukraine, misjudged the clown, not such a clown. In the case of Guatemala, he was a clown, and a reconfigured network took hold. So that happens frequently. And that's why that window of opportunity right after a change in power, or if there's a big scandal, for example, Watergate in the United States created a window of opportunity for very significant reforms, which at the time were put in place. When you see a window of opportunity, jump on it. Don't sleep. You don't have much time. You have to be ready to really work around the clock. And it means that when you're not in a window of opportunity situation, prepare yourself. Prepare what you're going to do. Do what you can, but also be prepared so that you can hit the ground running when a window of opportunity opens. Now let's get a little bit personal. So one of the ways that corrupt networks fight back is by addicting their opponents to the drug that they're addicted to. Partly that can be money. The enablers that I was talking about, they're bought off pretty cheap. I mean, at Carnegie, the salaries are comfortable, but they're 6 figures. They're not like crazy. They got bought off pretty cheap to whitewash the reputation of a Nigerian kleptocrat. Be careful of this stuff. But even more, be careful of comfort. How often do we say, we've got a running joke over here about Amazon? Oh, I'll buy this on Amazon. You don't have to buy a book on Amazon. Thank God you don't have too much Amazon here in Latvia, but we do. And everybody, because it's more convenient, oh, I'll buy it on Amazon. Oh, Amazon is a monopoly. It's influencing government. It's putting independent bookstores out of business, so we're losing our tissue of small businesses. It is pushing down the price at which it will purchase books, so people like me don't get advances that we can live on. And the working conditions are so bad, this is in the United States, people in the warehouse who have to, you know, fill the orders and everything, they have to wear diapers because they don't get bathroom breaks. This is the United States of America in the 21st century. For that, I need my package tomorrow, enough that I am willing to vote with my money in favor of that business model? Really? Convenience is a dangerous drug. And, you know, again, in the United States, the Supreme Court has told us that money is speech. If so, let's speak with this stuff. Let's speak in favor of business models we approve of, and let us deny corrupt business models our money. And finally, well, 2 related finallys. One is, I've been tough on my own country for the last hour or more. I don't consider that to be disloyal. I consider it to be an act of loyalty to hold my community up to its highest standards. And I do the same with, I don't belong to a political party, but the political party that I vote for, I'm tougher on my own than I am on the other side. I'm not saying I'm a paragon of virtue. I'm saying we all need to. We are social animals. that means that we are very sensitive to the opinions of our peers, of our in-group. So if we want to make a difference in terms of corruption, we need to hold our in-group up to its highest standards of integrity. Because if all we do is point the fingers at the out-group, they don't care. They're used to us criticizing them. And they criticize us, and we all just discount what they say. No. What matters is what you say to your best friend, to your sister, to your professional colleague. Hold your family, your business, your political party, your gender community, your cultural community up to its highest standards. And you know where I'm going with this. Along with researching, the 95 Theses, the other piece of homework I have for you, every one of you, go home and write a list of your values. What are your key, most important values? Then write a list of what types of behavior you actually promote in what you do, where you spend your money, what you smile at in public, what you write, see how your behavior either advances those values or in some cases inadvertently obstructs them or even advances opposing values, right? And see what you can do. None of us is an angel, God, but let's just change a little bit. And while we're doing it, we might discover that making those changes is not a sacrifice. It's actually fun. Let's make the fight against corruption into a celebration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Here in the room, we are those who fight corruption. And I hope that everyone of you thought about your windows of opportunities, as Sarah mentioned and advised us. I want to ask to the audience, but I would like to raise the question not to you, but to the audience, which is our next window of opportunities. Do you have any questions here from the audience? Or you are already, everything is clear?
Hello, thank you for a very comprehensive.
Yes. A little dense, sorry about that.
Quite fine. Yes, there is a culture of impunity everywhere, and there is corruption everywhere. And that's what I want to ask you, give you my thoughts and ask for your comment. It seems to me that corruption has lost, perhaps because of overuse, its significance, its oomph, its power, based on a lot of people that I speak to, from government officials to young people in so many countries. The attitude seems to be, well, yes, corruption is everywhere, so we're not going to do anything about it, or we're excused. Well, younger people, well, corruption is there, there's nothing we can do about it. They become pessimistic, they close off to the community. I was thinking perhaps there might be another word that connects more strongly with people, that in a strong way correlates with corruption, and that's stealing, being a thief. Nobody likes to have a thief around. Nobody likes to have their things stolen. But when you say corrupt, well, it's okay. Corruption is everywhere. I've had ministers, prime ministers say, well, corruption is everywhere. And you have demonstrated that very clearly about the US. There's a lot of corruption. And so that's an excuse. Well, if the US is corrupt, then it's okay if we're corrupt too, because that's the US, right?
So my answer on that is a little more.
Thank you. As an example, in this particular case, there was a meeting here with the candidates for being a prime minister, 6 different parties. And I put the direct question, I said, talking about corruption and some of the issues connected with corruption in this country, I said, all I ask from you is to say that you are going to work hard to decrease, not eradicate, but to decrease corruption. Of the 6 of them, 4 of them didn't even respond. three of them. One said, well, corruption is everywhere. Another one said, corruption is and always will be. Only one candidate said, I will work to decrease corruption or eradicate it. That's what we're dealing with because it's just become so common. And
so a couple of thoughts. Number one is my last book is called Thieves of State. No word corruption in, then corruption in the subtitle. Thieves of State. So yes. But what I would say is writing my most recent book on the United States, I actually took a look at history. And I found that, yes, corruption, quote, has always existed, and we heard that in the panel. The difference is between corruption being the system, corruption as the organizing principle of a political economic system, which is the case right now throughout most of the world, and corruption where there is some chance of the thief being caught. So you used the word thief, and we had a participant in the conversation earlier talk about how she would like to have leave her bicycle unlocked. Very nice. Chances are, if her bicycle was stolen, if she had the serial number of it, there's a pretty high likelihood that the thief would be caught. Certainly if she were knocked over for someone to steal her bicycle, the person who smacked her in the face would likely be caught and put to jail. Well, here's what I'm saying. But when you have corrupt procurement where the person has stolen hundreds of millions of euros, they're not getting caught. So this is, again, we have a focus on street crime, and we ignore this much, much more dangerous type of criminal activity. In the United States, we've had quite a discussion about criminal justice reform because of the propensity of US police officers to beat up and kill, usually people of color. And so there was a lot of talk about reducing funding for street police in order to move some of that funding to mental health services and other types of social services. I'm in favor of that, but there are some police officers or investigators, and there's one of them sitting in the third row back there, who need more resources. We need to there are non-dangerous, non-violent crimes, like smoking marijuana, for example. I have a hard time saying that that's a really terrible, non-violent crime that people need to be in jail for. I don't do it. But then there are types of nonviolent crime that are unbelievably dangerous, and the prison sentences do not need to be reduced for those types of crimes. They need to be increased. So that's part of the answer, but then let me go back to this historical. What I found is that there was a period when corruption was the system throughout much of the industrialized world, and that was the period from about 1870 until about 1935-ish. And here's what really terrified me when I really looked into it. It didn't matter not only what political party was in charge, it didn't matter what political system was in charge. The German Empire, the French Republic, both Third and Fourth Republics, the English monarchy, the US, whatever we are, Federal Republic, under both parties, Democrat and Republican, were engaged in the same type of absolutely systemic corruption at the expense of the population. That was pretty scary. There were also really sophisticated protest movements across Europe and the United States, and they didn't really get anywhere. This is why I think corruption is much more than, oh, it's a hindrance to business practices and stuff like that. It's an existential threat. Why? What did it take to bounce us out of it last time? 2 world wars. If I understand correctly, the First World War cost this area until it became independent at the end of the First World War, it cost you 1/3 of your population dead and deported and refugees. 1/3 of your population. It was 2 genocides between First and Second World War, use of the nuclear bomb, a pandemic that makes COVID look like, you know, a pretty good second best, and an economic meltdown that brought down the economies of half the world. And that bought us about 40 years where corruption was, it still existed, but it was no longer the operating principle of governments across, you know, across half of the globe. So why I'm really worried about this is that the period from 1980 until now looks almost identical to the period from 1870 until 1935. So when you say that people shrug at corruption, people shrugged at corruption back then too, until we got hit by massive international calamities. Well, what are the 21st century calamities going to look like? So you're right, any device we can use to try to make people realize how critically dangerous this thing is. Yes, it's stealing, but again, if somebody steals my bicycle, I'm not going to be happy, but it's, you know, we're talking way bigger than stealing a bicycle here.
Thank
Anybody
you.
else?
We have 2 more questions.
Hi, I'm Kaspars Viškens. I'm a member of parliament with the Progressive Party, and I'd be very happy to sign that pledge that you mentioned earlier.
Great.
But my question is, and I wanted to open that as a new dimension, you didn't speak much about that, is the role of tax policy and global tax architecture as maybe a factor that's perpetuating these networks.
Absolutely.
A few years back, Nicholas Shaxton, the British journalist, was here to speak about his Treasure Islands, a wonderful book that speaks about offshore banking, the tax havens. Also, the US-based tax foundation always ranks Latvia as having one of the best tax systems in the world, whereas, of course, we know that it heavily taxes labor at the expense of financial capital, real estate, including idle real estate. So could you speak a little bit about the importance of
100%.
Tax architecture?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I really appreciate it. Because when I talked about bending the rules, those are the types of rules I'm talking about, the rules that change what gets taxed. And it's labor versus capital, but then there are all kinds of little, you know, in the United States, the very richest people pay 0 taxes. And it's so fascinating. The Trump, you know, what's it called, slogan was Make America Great Again, right? So when, I'd love to sit down with the guy and say, okay, when are you talking about that America was great? My suspicion is he means that post-war period. But during that post-war period, we had a much more equal tax code, much more equal tax code. Income inequality was much, much lower than it is now. And the tax code is part of that, but it's not all of it. But it has a very significant role to play. And so what we're having, we also hear, as you see, I'm not the short answer kind of gal, so I'm going to take another little curly cue here. Another thing that's driving me crazy, we all crossed the boundary of 8. Do you all remember this? 8 billion? It was maybe a week or 2 ago. There are 8 billion of us Homo sapiens on this poor planet, okay? And then I'm listening to my former radio, National Public Radio, and they've got somebody on who's saying, don't worry, 10 billion, no problem, we just need to consume less. And besides, we need more people to fuel economic growth. I'm like, now, wait a second. I thought the economy was in service of people. I didn't think that the great God economy was like, you know, out there and we need to, you know, have more babies in order to serve the great God economy. The point is, the great God economy, economic growth has served whom? The super rich. Let's all take a look at the economic growth since 1980 and see where it's gone in all of our societies. It's gone to the top 5 or 1%. And that's partly because of the tax code. And then you have corporations that not only don't pay taxes on their profits, But I don't know if it happens here, but in the US, they are given tax-free, they're given all of these benefits from the public purse in order to locate themselves somewhere because, oh, the corporations so kindly choose to employ a few people. I mean, we've cut it backwards. But again, it's a sort of, so back to calling it a thief rather than calling it corruption, there's a language problem here. We have relinquished language to the forces of corruption. We have allowed the super rich to frame the terms of the debate, and we don't look at it. So I think you said you teach critical thinking at the business school. So it seems to me that we need both sides of that equation, critical and thinking. And that means there is no innocent word. Look at the words that are being used. When you hear that we need a rising population in order to fuel economic growth, what that is the super rich need a rising population to keep their incomes being infinite. And my understanding of infinite growth is, I'm just pausing because my sister just had an operation. Infinite growth is called cancer and it's fatal. Why do we think that infinite growth on a finite planet is a good thing? Like, how can we bend our minds around that piece of idiocy? And it was Greta Thunberg who said it in front of the whole world, much better than I just did. I think we have one last question.
One last, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Inese as well. We met yesterday.
Yes.
And I want to have a question that will focus on the positive side. But I really appreciate and liked the way you talked about this as a threat, because we need a little bit more of that. We, in certain bubbles of the society of Latvia, have become a little bit complacent, having gone out of the very bad situation. Now the question is it bad or better, right? There was this discussion of half glass full or empty.
Right.
So we need a little bit of alert from time to time. The positive side. One of the corruption researchers I like and follow is Bo Rothstein from Sweden, and he has this wonderful correlations where the countries that control corruption live better, live longer, have better income, and that doesn't correlate with democracy or any other fluffy freedoms, but all these good things in society do correlate with controlling corruption. So my question is about the United States. Which are, to your mind, the most critical institutions, mechanisms that play the role to withstand corruption in the United States? Because despite all of what you told us, the country is still managing and is still getting over with. And in Latvia, we see it. There are a number of the pillars that are important. There is a theory, but we also here we see that it's not always would not always be only the Anti-Corruption Bureau. It can be other institutions that come into play. It can be civil society. It can be many things. So what are these critical institutions from your mind?
So, in fact, I would say that law enforcement is necessarily very narrow. It just takes too much time and personnel to make these cases. The cases are very complex, and anti-corruption law enforcement is often outmatched by the amount of lawyers that a corrupt person or entity can bring to bear. And that's why I was so focused on the issue of mapping and carefully selecting targets, because you need to aim your resources very carefully in terms of anti-corruption. So I don't have great news for the United States. I really don't. And when you say it looks from here that the US is functioning, let me elaborate on that a little bit more. As I said, I just told you about our failures. And in any other country, you know, you lose 2 wars, you blow up the world economy, you know, 4 million Americans were thrown out of their houses after 2008. 4 million Americans. That's an IDP crisis. That's an internally displaced people crisis. But it doesn't get seen that way because of reputation, right? The reputation of the United States. That's, I mean, but let me take this down to a particular industry, which is oil. I wrote a paper with a colleague, and she did all the work, about the oil curse, which is something that is seen in a number of countries around the world, countries that depend on, and in particular export, fossil fuels. Typically, first you get what's called the Dutch disease, I think, where that was initially, it was the Netherlands, but it's a distorted economy. You get a distorted economy, there comes too much dependence on that one source, the economy de-diversifies, and then that one source becomes ripe for capture, so the next thing that happens is corruption, and then corruption almost inevitably starts leading to security issues, conflict, and all-out war. So we developed a map that mapped oil-producing countries and gave them colors as to where they were on the spectrum, with, let's say, Nigeria being black, or Angola, where there was a lot of bloody, you know, uprisings and things like that. And on the green side, we had Norway, for example, and the United States. Paper gets published, and I start thinking about it. I say, now, wait a second. United States is a big country with quite a lot, even still, of revenue distribution. Not as much as in Scandinavia, for example. So I said, what if we look at a subnational level? Where are the places in the United States where fossil fuels are extracted and exported from? Where I live, Appalachia, it is the poorest and most corrupt region of the country. You have Eastern California, poorest and most corrupt. You have the upper Great Plains near the border with Canada, the same thing. I realized, my God, if you shaded the map of the United States according to the fossil fuel extraction areas, you would find the resource curse within the United States. So I think what I'm saying is, so that's one story. Another story is that I am on a listserv, you know, one of these email chains, of about 300 organizations that are for good governance. So something like Transparency International, except that our Transparency International doesn't look at US corruption. It's very interesting. But it's, you know, Common Cause and Citizens for Respect and Ethics in Washington, CREW, Citizens for Respect and Ethics in Washington. All of these organizations that are focused on good governance in the United States. So during the 2020 presidential campaign, someone sends around something about how it's a foreign intelligence agency that has been passing around the bad press on Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. I write back to the whole group saying, okay, got it. Some wrongful things have been put in by wrongful people, perhaps, but is the Hunter Biden business model really something that we, as a community of anti-corruption individuals and entities, do we really want to be defending that business model? Or is there a way that we can say, these accusations are lies purveyed by a foreign intelligence agency, but we hope that when Biden is elected president, he will expend his personal and governmental authority to curb this business model? That was the question that I put out to, there are about 300 people from some dozens of groups. I got 4 answers back, all of them contrary to what I said, all of them in opposition to what I said. So I have to tell you, Ines, that I am not at all sanguine or positive about the state of anti-corruption efforts in the United States. I also know we have someone from the Department of Justice here. I know some of his colleagues who worked in the public integrity department and who worked in countries not too far from here, doing a job similar to the one that you're doing. But when they went back to the public integrity beat. And one of them said, I'm asking to be transferred because now the legal definition of corruption is so narrow that I can't make an interesting case. You have to be a really terrible criminal to get prosecuted, this person said, under our current judicial definition and system of corruption. And he said, I don't mean a bad, dangerous criminal. I mean poor at being a criminal. And so I am concerned that, as you suggested, there is on one level too much acceptance of corruption as the way things are done, particularly among elites in America. That's the other thing I was going to ask you, is who says this is how it's done? It's usually people who are getting something out of it who say it that way. So when I raised the issue of these Supreme Court decisions with like legal experts in Washington and lawyers and things like that, they said, oh my God, but if he went to jail, then everybody in Washington would be liable for prosecution. And I said, yeah. And so what do people do instead? They react, when people feel there is no civic recourse, that's when they turn to extremes. So what did Americans do? They voted extremely. And then what did they do? They stormed the Capitol building. And as much as I detest what those people stood for, it felt a little bit like the Reformation. They were going, as I said, they were defecating on statues inside the Capitol building. It's not that different from chopping off the noses of statues in churches. And so that's what I'm concerned about in the United States, is instead of us uniting for integrity in government, we are coming up with a different explanation, which is the Trumpies are corrupt. Hillary Clinton is corrupt. Like when I wrote this book, I wanted it to be a kind of framework to help people understand what was going on in our country. And instead what I found was by the time it came out, they had hardened into their partisan explanations. That was much more comfortable because my book asked them to look in the mirror. And instead what they're saying is, oh, the Democratic Party is, we're good and it's Trump. And don't, Trump, but Trump's worse than we are. Yeah, we've got a couple of, but they're worse, and then the Trump people, they're worse. And that way, I think, will land us in disaster. So I'm sorry, you wanted me to be positive. And what I would say to be positive, here's your last piece of homework.
Yes, please give us the last piece of homework.
So remember, 95 theses, and what are your values and what do you do? Now, the next thing I want each of you to do is find a tree in this gorgeous city of yours. Find a tree that you love. And I ask you, visit that tree once a week for the rest of your lives. And just, I'm serious. You visit friends once a week, but those are our friends too, and they actually respond to us, and it will change how you see the world. Thank you so much for putting up with me.
Thank you very much, Sāra. Liels paldies, Sārai. Mēs esam runājuši par korupciju daudz ilgāk nekā sākumā plānots, bet acīm redzot tieši tāpēc, ka tā ir tik sarežģīta problēma. Daži jau steidzās. Pavisam ātri noslēdzot mūsu šīs dienas pasākumu Korupcija Nacionālās un globālās drošības drauds. Liels paldies Korupcijas novēršanas apkarošanas birojam Amerikas Savienoto Valstu vēstniecībai par atbalstu. Turpināsim šīs sarunas rīt Starptautiskajā cilvēktiesību dienā, turpināsim šīs sarunas pirmdien un pirmdien sāksim savu darbu, jo pirmdien ir pirmdiena un darba diena. Un visticamāk, mēs cerams, ka vēl ātrāk nekā pirms gada līdzīgā jautājuma, svarīguma pasākumā varēsim runāt par to, ko tad mēs jau esam izdarījuši un kas ir nākamie darbi, ko mēs apņemamies darīt, lai tiešām šo korupciju mazinātu. Paldies visiem par uzmanību.